He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull her aside first. Adrian Moretti stood in the center of his own grand ballroom, surrounded by every capo, every lieutenant, every man who had ever kissed his ring, and introduced another woman as the one standing beside him now. Not a colleague, not a friend. His mistress. Selena Voss, draped in a red gown that cost more than most people's cars, smiled like she'd already won. And maybe she thought she had. The room went stone quiet. 200 people held their breath. Every eye in that ballroom slid toward Vivian Hale, the woman who had stood beside Adrian Moretti for 17 years, who had smiled through every rough winter, who had bled quietly so this empire could breathe. They were waiting for her to break. She didn't. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you built everything with, stay with me. Because what happens next will change how you see power, loyalty, and what it truly means to walk away. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment below with your city or country. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The night had started the way all Moretti gatherings started, with too much money on display and not enough honesty in the room. The estate sat on a ridge above the Hudson, close enough to Manhattan that you could see the skyline glittering through the tall windows, but removed enough that whatever happened inside those walls felt like it existed in its own country, with its own laws. The driveway alone was half a mile long, lined with black SUVs and the occasional foreign sedan belonging to men who'd flown in from places they'd rather not name publicly. Security stood at every door. Nobody got through without being on a list, and the list was short. Vivian had spent the better part of the afternoon in the kitchen, not cooking, she hadn't cooked in years, but supervising, making sure the floral arrangements came from the right vendor, making sure the hired staff understood exactly how the evening was meant to flow. She'd done this 17 times now, 17 years of these parties, and she still felt the low hum of anxiety before each one, that familiar tightness behind her ribs that told her anything could go wrong if she stopped paying attention for even a minute. She was wearing a deep navy gown she'd chosen 3 weeks ago, simple, elegant. It suited her the way most things suited Vivian, quietly, without demanding attention. Her hair was pulled back at the nape of her neck, and the only jewelry she wore was her wedding ring and a small pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. She wasn't trying to outshine anyone. She never had been. That had always been the difference between her and the room she walked into every year. The guests arrived between 7 and 8, capos from the outer boroughs, international business partners who understood that the Moretti name carried legal weight in 3 different countries, even if the source of that weight was never discussed at dinner. Lawyers, bankers, a city councilman who believed, probably incorrectly, that his presence here would never become a problem for him. Old money and new money sharing the same air, which always created a kind of static that Vivian had learned to read the way some people read weather. She moved through the room the way she always did, present but not loud, attentive but not hovering. She remembered every name, every spouse's name, every detail that made each person feel seen. It was a skill she'd developed over years, and it cost her something every time. Not everyone understood that being gracious was work, that it drained you the same as any other labor. Sal Benedetti cornered her near the bar at 7:15, wanting to talk about the Lakeview acquisition, and she spent 12 minutes making him feel like the conversation was his idea, while actually redirecting him away from 2 details that weren't ready to be discussed yet. By the time she walked away, he thought he'd made a decision. He hadn't. She had. That was also how it usually went. She noticed the shift in the room before she saw the cause of it. It started near the main entrance, a ripple in the noise, the specific hush that happens when something changes. Vivian was refilling her glass of water at the far end of the room when she felt it, that change in temperature, the way a crowd unconsciously rearranges itself around a new center of gravity. She turned slowly, glass in hand, and looked toward the doorway. Adrian had arrived. He was always late to his own parties. It was deliberate, a power move she'd watched him perfect over years, the entrance designed to remind everyone in the room who they were waiting for. He was dressed in a dark suit that fit him well, because everything fit Adrian well, and his face carried the particular expression he wore in rooms full of people who answered to him. Not quite a smile. More of a permission, the look that told the room it could now begin. She'd seen it 1,000 times. It used to make her proud. What she had not seen before was the woman on his arm. Vivian registered the red dress first. then the height, then the face. Younger, deliberately beautiful, the kind of beauty that required maintenance and attention and made sure everyone in the room understood it. The woman moved with the confidence of someone who had been told she was remarkable so many times she'd started to believe it structurally, the way a building believes its own foundation. Vivian had seen her before, once, briefly, 3 months ago. A name mentioned in passing, a name Vivian had filed away the way she filed away everything that might eventually matter. Selena Voss. 31 years old, originally from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Had worked in finance before transitioning into the kind of social world where your connections were your currency. She hadn't realized at the time that the name was going to walk through her front door on her husband's arm. The room watched her. She knew they were watching. 200 people, all of them measuring the space between Vivian's expression and whatever they'd been expecting. Some of them had probably known. Men like the ones in this room always knew things they chose not to say out loud. She wondered which of them had known, and for how long, and whether any of them had considered for even a moment that she deserved to hear it from someone other than her husband's body language. She didn't move. She didn't change her expression. She stood with her glass of water and watched Adrian guide Selena Voss through his ballroom, accepting greetings, absorbing the careful silence of men who were recalibrating in real time. He hadn't looked at Vivian yet. She noticed that too. Marco Ferrante appeared at her elbow, which was what Marco always did in uncomfortable moments, materialized with the specific uselessness of a man who wanted credit for being present without having to do anything. "Vivian," he started. "Don't," she said quietly. He closed his mouth. She set her glass down on a nearby tray and straightened her spine by exactly 1 centimeter, the private adjustment she made when she needed to remind herself what she was made of. Then Adrian saw her. Their eyes met across the room, across the chandeliers and the catered food and the 200 witnesses, and she watched something pass through his expression. Not guilt exactly, something more complex than guilt. A calculation, she thought. He was calculating how she was going to respond. Even now, in this moment, he was running the numbers on her. He walked toward her. Selena came with him, because of course she did. And then he stopped in front of his wife, with his mistress beside him, in his own house, in front of everyone who worked for him, and he said, not loudly, but loudly enough, "Vivian, I'd like to introduce you to Selena. She'll be accompanying me from now on." The words were almost absurdly plain, no decoration, no softening. She'd half expected something elaborate, some story constructed to make the moment easier for everyone except her. But Adrian had never bothered with elaborate when blunt was available. It was one of the things she'd once admired about him. "From now on," she repeated. "Yes." She looked at Selena Voss, who had the intelligence to look slightly uncomfortable and the vanity to hide it poorly. Then she looked back at her husband. She studied his face the way you study a problem you're trying to solve. Not with anger, not with the dramatic grief that everyone in the room was braced for, but with the particular attention of someone who is making a final decision. She reached down and removed her wedding ring. Not frantically, not with shaking hands. Slowly and deliberately, the way you remove a bandage when you've decided the wound underneath doesn't need it anymore. She set it on the tray beside her empty glass. Then she walked to the mahogany side table near the window, the one she'd had positioned there herself 3 weeks ago because she was a woman who prepared for contingencies. And she picked up the legal folder that had been sitting inside the table's lower shelf, sealed and waiting. She placed the folder on the tray beside the ring. Every person in that room who could see her was watching. The ones who couldn't see her were watching the ones who could. She turned back to Adrian. Her face was completely composed. Not cold, composed. There was a difference, and Vivian had spent years understanding it. "If she's truly worthy of your empire," Vivian said, and her voice was steady and clear as river water, "let her be the one who saves it." Then she turned and walked to the door. She did not hurry. She did not look back. She collected her coat from the attendant by the entrance with a quiet thank you, because she thanked everyone who worked, even now, even tonight. And she walked out through the front door and down the steps to the car that had been idling at the bottom of the drive since 6:30, because she had called for it that morning. She had known. Not everything, not the red dress or the specific moment, but enough. She had known for 3 weeks that something was coming, and she had spent those 3 weeks making sure she was ready for it. The gates of the Moretti estate closed behind her car. Inside the ballroom, the silence lasted approximately 4 seconds before Dominic Rial's voice broke it, a low comment to the man beside him that Vivian would never hear. And then the room slowly, uncomfortably, began to breathe again. Adrian stood where she'd left him, holding nothing, looking at the tray with the wedding ring and the sealed legal folder, and Selena Voss stood beside him with her hand no longer on his arm. He picked up the folder. His fingers worked the seal. The paper inside was dense, 47 pages of financial instruments, corporate guarantees, trust documentation, and a cover letter from an attorney named Naomi Cross, whose firm operated out of a midtown office tower and whose reputation Adrian had reason to know well. He read the first page, then the second. He was still reading when his personal attorney, Raymond Chu, pushed through the crowd toward him with the specific expression of a man delivering news he does not want to deliver. "Adrian." Raymond's voice was barely above a whisper. "We have a problem." Adrian looked up from the folder. "We have several," he said. He was not wrong. The legal folder contained something Vivian had assembled over 3 weeks with the kind of quiet, methodical precision that had characterized everything she'd ever done for the Moretti organization. And what it contained was simple to describe and devastating to absorb. Every legitimate corporation shielding the Moretti syndicate from federal scrutiny, the ones that turned illegal money into legal money, that gave the organization a clean face for regulators and tax authorities and banking partners. Every single one of them depended on one thing: Vivian's signature. Not Adrian's, not the organization's, hers. Because 17 years ago, when they were building something from the wreckage of the previous generation's mistakes, it had been Vivian's family name, Vivian's credit, Vivian's relationships with old money banking families who would have never dealt with an organization that smelled like the Morettis, that gave the whole structure its legal foundation. She had put herself at the center of it because she believed in the life they were building together, and because she was smarter than anyone in the room had ever given her credit for. And because she'd believed for a very long time that love was enough of a reason. The holding companies, the international investment vehicles, the real estate trusts, the casino licensing agreements in 2 jurisdictions, the art funds and the shipping partnerships, and the Luxembourg banking relationships that allowed money to move across borders without setting off alarms. All of it, every clean layer on top of the organization's dirty core, ran through Vivian Hale Moretti's legal identity like a central nervous system. Without her active cooperation, the whole structure began to seize. Raymond laid it out in short, careful sentences while Adrian stood with the folder in his hands, and Selena stood 3 feet away, close enough to hear everything, far enough to start understanding that she had wandered into something she didn't understand. "The Hartfield Trust expires without renewal," Raymond said. "That's the one that covers the Meridian Hotel properties. The renewal requires her signature and a face-to-face verification with the banking board, which is in Geneva, and which she scheduled for next month. If we can't produce her, I know what happens if we can't produce her. The Cascadia Fund, Raymond, has a quarterly compliance filing due in 11 days. It's her fund, Adrian. She's the named principal. Without her authorization, I said I know. There's more." Adrian looked at him. "The Federal Monitoring Agreement." Raymond's voice dropped further. "The one we've been operating under for the past 4 years that's kept the DOJ from escalating their inquiry. That agreement exists because Vivian personally vouched for the organization's financial legitimacy to 3 separate federal officials. Her credibility was the agreement. If she withdraws her cooperation, she wouldn't," Adrian said. Raymond said nothing. "She wouldn't expose herself," Adrian said. "She's too deep in this." "She retained Naomi Cross this morning." Raymond held up his phone, showing an email chain. "Ms. Cross filed preliminary disclosure immunity paperwork with the Southern District 2 hours ago. Vivian has already begun the process of separating her legal identity from the organization. Everything she signed under duress or under the reasonable assumption of marital partnership can potentially be reclassified. Cross is good at this. She's very good at this." Adrian set the folder down on the tray with the wedding ring. He looked at the ring for a moment. Then he looked across the room to where Selena was standing, and something in his expression had changed, not softened, nothing so simple as that, but reconfigured. He was looking at her the way he looked at a business decision that had gone wrong. Selena noticed. She was perceptive enough for that. She took 1 step toward him. "Adrian, give me a minute," he said. She stopped. Across the ballroom, the party had not exactly resumed, but people had begun performing the actions of a party, refilling drinks, murmuring to each other, finding reasons to be occupied. Because 200 people who make their living reading rooms had collectively decided that watching Adrian Moretti process a crisis in real time was not a safe use of their attention. Sal Benedetti found a reason to be near the bar. Tommy Ricci, who ran the waterfront operations, drifted toward the window. The city councilman looked like he was considering whether the emergency exit was an option. In the kitchen, a young server named Elena, who had no idea what was happening and cared only that the shrimp cocktail was running low, went to find more shrimp. Life continued in its ordinary, oblivious way around the edges of the catastrophe. Raymond Chu said, quietly, "There's something else. Something we found out about an hour ago that I haven't had a chance to tell you." Adrian looked at him. The Donovan group called. Their representative, the new one, Whitmore, apparently received a communication from Vivian's attorney this afternoon. A courtesy call, Whitmore said, letting them know that Ms. Hale would no longer be able to guarantee the Moretti organization's financial commitments to the Donovan Group's board. The Donovan Group was the most important legitimate banking partnership the Moretti organization had. It was the thing that made everything else possible. It was the door to respectability that every other door had been built toward. Adrian sat down in a chair. He didn't sit down in chairs at parties. He stood, he moved, he presided. But he sat down now, in a brocade chair near the window, and he looked out at the Manhattan skyline, and for the first time in a very long time, he looked exactly like a man who had made a mistake he could not charm or threaten his way out of. Selena crossed the room and sat beside him. She put her hand on his arm with the careful gesture of someone who was trying to look helpful without knowing what helping would mean. "It'll be fine," she said. He looked at her hand on his arm. "You should go home," he said. "Adrian, tonight. You should go home tonight." She opened her mouth, closed it. The room was watching them now. Not everyone, but enough. The same 200 people who had watched him introduce her an hour ago were now watching him send her away. And there was something in the collective attention that felt very much like a verdict. She stood up. She kept her face composed because she had her own kind of pride, and she wasn't going to shatter it in front of these people. She picked up her clutch from the chair beside her. She walked toward the exit with her spine straight and her chin level and her red dress trailing behind her, and nobody moved to stop her or say goodbye. The door closed behind her. Adrian sat alone in his chair. He picked up the wedding ring from the tray. It was a simple band, not the original. That one had been replaced at their 10th anniversary with something Vivian had chosen herself. Understated, no diamonds, just a clean gold band she'd said felt more honest. He turned it in his fingers once, twice. Then he put it in his jacket pocket. He stood up and looked at Raymond Chu. "Get me a meeting with every senior capo by 9 tomorrow morning." Raymond nodded. "And find out where she is." "She hasn't told anyone where she's going." "I know," Adrian said. "Find out anyway." Raymond left. The party staggered on for another 90 minutes, because these were men who had survived worse than an uncomfortable evening, and because nobody wanted to be the first to leave and look like they were rattled. They ate the food. They drank the whiskey. They talked carefully about nothing. But the room had changed. Something had shifted in it the moment Vivian Hale walked out the door, and every person there, whether they admitted it or not, felt the difference. Like a note missing from a chord, like a load-bearing wall removed. They didn't fully understand yet what she'd taken with her. That understanding would come in the morning. The next day began with phone calls. They started before 6, before the city had finished deciding whether it was awake. Raymond Chu fielded the first 6 himself, making notes in his small leather notebook, his handwriting getting progressively smaller as the calls accumulated, the way his handwriting always compressed when he was managing genuine alarm. The capos didn't call each other first. They called their own attorneys. Then their accountants. Then, when their attorneys and accountants confirmed what they were seeing, they called each other. Vincent Caruso, who ran the real estate portfolio, spent 40 minutes on the phone with his banking contact in Zurich before calling Raymond and saying, with the specific flatness of a man who has processed a shock and come out the other side, "Raymond, the Meridian Properties. Walk me through what we're looking at." Raymond walked him through it. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Raymond checked to see if the call had dropped. "She was the principal on all of them?" Vincent finally said. "On all the legal instruments, yes." How did we not know that? Because it was never relevant before. Another silence. It's relevant now, Vincent said. Tommy Ricci called next, about the shipping insurance policies connected to the Brooklyn waterfront. 3 policies that were held through a subsidiary whose parent company was, when you traced it back through 3 layers of corporate structure, registered to Vivian Hale Moretti personally. Tommy was a man who didn't panic. He had the kind of temperament that stayed level through emergencies. But his voice, when he called Raymond, had the specific quality of a level man who was working very hard to stay that way. Tell me I'm misreading this, Tommy said. I can't tell you that. Tell me there's a way to restructure. There's potentially a way to restructure. But restructuring takes time, and some of these instruments don't give us time. The Hartfield Trust, Vincent's properties. We have 11 days before compliance filing. Less for the Donovan Group communication. They're calling for a board review. On whose authority? On the authority of the fact that their primary guarantor has retained independent counsel and filed for legal separation from the organization. Their board has liability concerns. Tommy made a sound that wasn't a word. Where's Vivian? He asked. We don't know yet. What do you mean you don't know? She left last night. She hasn't made contact with anyone connected to us. Her personal cell goes to voicemail. The house she owns in Connecticut, her house, separate from the estate. We had someone drive by this morning. Her car isn't there. Tommy was quiet for a moment. She planned this, he said. Yes. She planned this before last night. The document she left, the one she put on the tray, it was prepared 3 weeks ago. The cover letter is dated. She had it assembled and ready. Tommy exhaled slowly. She knew he was going to do it, Tommy said. She knew before last night that he was going to pull that stunt with the woman, and she spent 3 weeks getting ready for it. That's what the timeline suggests. And none of us knew. None of us. Another silence. Then, that says something about us, Raymond. That says something about how much attention we were paying. Raymond didn't answer that, because there was no answer he could offer that wasn't an indictment. Adrian arrived at the estate at 8:30. He'd spent the night in the city, which he hadn't told anyone and didn't explain, and by the time he walked into his own study, 3 of his senior capos were already there, waiting. Not the way they usually waited for him, with the comfortable posture of men in their own territory. They were seated with the specific stiffness of men who have information they're not sure how to deliver. He sat behind his desk. He looked at each of them. Tell me, he said. They told him. Not all at once, and not without the careful verbal navigation of men who were reporting bad news to someone capable of making bad things happen. But methodically, piece by piece, each of them contributing the part of the picture they'd assembled that morning, they laid it out. Vincent covered the real estate. Tommy covered the waterfront and the insurance instruments. A capo named Davis Holt, who oversaw the casino operations and who was the youngest in the room by a decade, covered the licensing agreements. The ones in 2 jurisdictions that depended on a clean corporate structure that passed regulatory review. A review that had been passing for 6 years because the structure's named principals had impeccable records, and the most impeccable record of all of them was Vivian's. Adrian listened to all of it without interrupting. When they were done, the room was quiet. He folded his hands on the desk. How long have you known that she was this integrated into the financial structure? He asked. Not angrily, almost academically. They looked at each other. We knew she handled the legitimate side, Vincent said carefully. We knew she was involved in the banking relationships, Tommy added. We didn't know the extent, Davis said. He was young enough and direct enough to just say it plainly. I don't think any of us understood the extent of it. Did she understand the extent of it? Adrian asked. Nobody answered. She understood every inch of it, Adrian said. She built it. She built it while we were paying attention to other things, and she built it in a way that made it work, and we treated that like housekeeping. He paused. And I treated her like housekeeping. The room absorbed that. It was not the kind of statement these men were accustomed to hearing from Adrian Moretti. He did not make confessions in business meetings. He did not characterize his own behavior in terms that implied fault. Whatever they'd been expecting from this morning, it hadn't been this. What's our exposure? Adrian said, returning to his normal register. Raymond, who had been standing by the window, answered. He'd spent the night compiling numbers. The answer was significant. Not immediately catastrophic, but building. The 11-day Hartfield deadline was the most urgent. The Donovan Group board review was the most dangerous long-term. The federal monitoring agreement was the most consequential if it unraveled. "Can we reach her?" Adrian asked. "She hasn't returned calls." "Not our calls," Adrian said. "Get me her attorney's number. Not to threaten, to talk." Raymond nodded. "And get me everything we have on the Donovan Group board," Adrian continued. "Every relationship we have with any individual on that board. I want to know who we can call." He was working. That was what he did when everything fell apart. He worked. He made lists and called people and found angles and pushed pressure where pressure could be applied. It was how he'd built the empire in the first place. It was what he was good at, what he was not good at, and what he was only beginning to understand this morning in the uncomfortable light of a problem he couldn't threaten into submission, was seeing clearly. He had not seen Vivian clearly. He had seen her as a constant, the way you see air or gravity. Something that existed in your life without requiring acknowledgement because it had never been absent. She had managed the legitimate architecture of his empire with a precision and an intelligence that he had systematically failed to notice, because noticing would have required him to adjust how he thought about her role, and adjusting how he thought about her role would have forced him to confront certain things about himself that he preferred to leave unexamined. He had not examined them. He was examining them now, alone at his desk after the capos had left, turning his wedding ring's absence in his mind the way he'd turned the physical ring in his fingers the night before. He picked up his phone and called Selena Voss. It rang twice. "Adrian." Her voice was careful, composed. She'd had the night to compose herself. "I'm not calling to apologize," he said. "I know. I'm calling because I owe you an honest conversation, and I didn't give you one last night." A pause. "All right. What happened last night, the way I introduced you, that wasn't fair to you. Whatever I was trying to accomplish with that, it was something I should have handled differently." Handled differently. She repeated the phrase with a particular flatness that told him she'd been up most of the night processing it. "You mean you shouldn't have done it?" "I mean, I handled it badly." "Because of the business problems," she said. "That's what this call is about. You're in trouble and you're managing optics." "Yes," he said. Because she was perceptive and she deserved the honesty, and also because admitting it plainly cost him less than denying it. Another pause, longer. "Did you know?" she asked. "When you brought me there last night, did you know what she'd put together? The legal stuff?" "No." "But you knew she wasn't going to just accept it." He thought about that. "I underestimated her," he said. "That," Selena said, "is very clear." The call ended shortly after that. Not with anger or tears, she was too controlled for either, but with the specific finality of a chapter closing on its last sentence. He set the phone down. Through the window of his study, the gardens of the estate were gray and wet. October had been damp, and the leaves were off the trees earlier than usual, and everything looked stripped. He thought about the first time he'd brought Vivian here, before the estate was fully renovated, when it was still a project and not an empire. She'd walked through every room with a legal pad and a pen, making notes. Not about the decor, about the structure, about what walls could come down and what walls were load-bearing. She always knew which walls were load-bearing. His phone rang. "Raymond." "Her attorney returned the call," Raymond said. "Naomi Cross, she's willing to talk. She said Vivian is available for a formal discussion in 10 days. That's her timeline, not ours." 10 days. The Hartfield filing was in 11. "What does she want?" Adrian asked. "She said she's happy to discuss that at the meeting. She doesn't give anything away." "She's very good," Raymond said. He thought about that. About Vivian, who had chosen her attorney well, who had been choosing things well for 17 years while he'd been looking in other directions. "Set it up," Adrian said. "Whatever timeline she needs." He ended the call and sat back in his chair. Outside, one of the groundskeepers was raking wet leaves from the pathway, a slow and futile task given the wind. The leaves came off the trees faster than they could be cleared. Adrian watched him work. He thought about what it cost a person to build something carefully, patiently, for years. What it took from you, what it asked of you, and what it meant when the person you'd built it with refused to see it, refused to name it, refused to acknowledge that you existed as anything other than a useful constant in their life. He thought about what a person was left with after years of that. And then he thought about what it had taken for Vivian to walk out of that ballroom without looking back. Not rage, not desperation. Something much harder to manufacture than either. The decision of a woman who had already grieved the loss and then gotten ready, and then simply waited for the moment to move. He sat with that for a long time. Outside, the groundskeeper gave up on the leaves and leaned his rake against the garden wall and went inside to find something warm to drink. The wind took the leaves where it wanted. The morning after the party, the Moretti estate felt like a house where someone had died. Not loudly, not with sirens or crying, the quiet kind of deaths. The kind where everything looks the same from the outside and everything is different on the inside, and the people moving through the rooms don't quite know what to do with their hands. The kitchen staff arrived at 7 and made coffee nobody came to drink. The security rotation changed at 8 with the usual efficiency, but the men doing it moved with a particular carefulness, the way people move in hospitals, hushed, deliberate, aware that something fragile was nearby. By 8:30, 3 black cars were parked in the driveway that hadn't been there the night before, and Raymond Chu was on his 4th call of the morning, standing in the hallway outside Adrian's study with his leather notebook pressed against his chest and his voice at a volume just above a murmur. Inside the study, Adrian had been awake since 5. He'd pulled the financial documents out again, not the folder Vivian had left, but his own records, the ones Raymond had assembled from internal files overnight. He'd spread them across the desk and gone through them the way he went through intelligence on a rival operation, looking for weaknesses, looking for angles, looking for the seam where pressure could be applied. He'd done this for 3 hours. He hadn't found what he was looking for, because what he was looking for was a way out that didn't exist. The documents were very clear, the exposure was very real, and Vivian, wherever she was, had structured things with a precision that left almost no gaps. He was on his 2nd cup of coffee when Davis Holt knocked on the study door. "Come in." Davis entered and closed the door behind him. He was 34, the youngest senior capo in the organization's recent history, and he'd gotten there because he was the kind of man who processed information without sentiment and delivered it the same way. Adrian had always respected that about him. This morning, it was useful. "The Nevada Licensing Board called," Davis said. He didn't sit down. He stood near the door, notebook in hand, the way he always stood when the news wasn't good. "They got a flag on the Meridian Casino license renewal. The corporate structure review triggered an automatic hold." "How long is the hold?" 60 days initially. "But if we can't produce documentation showing the principal structure is intact, it extends. And if it extends past the annual renewal date, we lose the license," Adrian said. "We lose the license." Adrian set down his coffee cup. "Who called them? Who triggered the flag?" Davis paused, just slightly. "It came from a law firm, Naomi Cross's office." The name again. That name was going to be following him for a while. "She's thorough," Adrian said. "She's very thorough," Davis confirmed. He turned a page in his notebook. "The Donovan Group Board called for an emergency review, as Raymond told you. But there's something new on that. Their general counsel reached out directly to our attorney, not Raymond, their own in-house person. And what they're asking about is not just the guarantor structure. They're asking about the DOJ monitoring agreement." Adrian looked up. "Why?" "Because if the monitoring agreement is at risk, their exposure changes. They've been doing business with us partly because of that agreement, because it meant we were under a certain kind of scrutiny that made things safe for them. If that scrutiny goes away, if the agreement collapses, we look unsupervised," Adrian said. "Exactly. And an unsupervised Moretti organization is a different business proposition than a monitored one, from the Donovan Group's perspective. So they're not backing away because we're exposed. They're backing away because we might become dangerous again." Davis considered that framing. "That's one way to read it, yes." Adrian stood up and walked to the window. The groundskeeper from yesterday was back on the pathway, raking again. The wind had undone whatever he'd done the day before. The man bent to it without apparent frustration, just working. "Who else knows about the Nevada flag?" Adrian asked. "Vincent, Tommy. They'll know within the hour, regardless. These things move through the network." "Then call them now. I want everyone in this room at noon, and I want Raymond there with the complete picture. Not the version we've been presenting to each other, the complete picture." Davis nodded. He turned to leave. "Davis?" He stopped. "The Lakeview acquisition. The one Sal Benedetti was pushing last night. Who was the backing institution? Davis turned back. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort, but its cousin. The backing institution was the Hartfield Trust, Vivian's trust. Adrian absorbed that. So if the trust goes into hold, the Lakeview deal falls apart. Yes. And Sal? Sal has personal exposure in that deal. He put his own money in alongside the organization's. Davis paused. He's going to be very unhappy. Then make sure he hears it from me, Adrian said. Not from a phone call. From me, directly, at noon. Davis left. Adrian turned back to the window. He thought about Sal Benedetti, who'd been moving around the edge of this organization for 20 years, and who'd always stayed loyal because the loyalty had been profitable. Sal unhappy was manageable. Sal unhappy and financially exposed was something else. He thought about how many other Sal Benedettis there were in the structure. How many people whose loyalty to the Moretti name was actually loyalty to their own accounts, and who would begin doing mathematics the moment the accounts looked uncertain. He thought about Vivian, who had understood all of this. Every thread, every dependency, every relationship between the money and the loyalty, and had used that understanding to build something ironclad. She had built an empire inside his empire, and he had looked at her across 17 years of dinners and meetings and late nights, and not once, not one single time, thought to ask himself what would happen if she left. The noon meeting was bad. Not in the way meetings were bad when something had gone wrong operationally. Not bad with noise and accusation and the theatrical anger of men performing outrage. It was bad the way a doctor's waiting room is bad. The silence of people sitting with information they haven't fully absorbed, each of them privately calculating what it meant for them personally. Vincent Caruso sat at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who had aged 3 years overnight. He'd spent the morning on calls with his own attorney, and whatever those calls had confirmed had settled into his face like bad weather that wasn't going anywhere. Tommy Ricci was at the table's middle, arms crossed. He wasn't a man who showed much, but his jaw was tight in the way that meant he was working through something, and the working wasn't finished. Sal Benedetti arrived 4 minutes late, which was unlike him. When he came in, he looked at Adrian first, a quick, measuring look, and then he sat down without speaking. Raymond was standing at the whiteboard at the room's end, which was unusual. Raymond generally delivered information from a chair, conversationally, the way someone might discuss the weather. The whiteboard meant he needed the room to understand the full picture, and needed them to see it written out. Adrian sat at the head of the table. "Raymond," he said. Raymond turned to the board and began. He went through it systematically. Corporate structure, legal principles, compliance timelines, federal exposure, the Donovan Group situation, the Nevada licensing hold, the Lakeview deal and its financing structure, which he put last deliberately, because that was where Sal's attention would catch, and Raymond wanted everyone else in the room to have the context before that happened. He spoke for 22 minutes without interruption. When he finished, the room was quiet for long enough that the sound of traffic on the road outside the estate became briefly audible. A truck passing on the service road, gears shifting, completely indifferent to everything happening in this room. Sal was the first to speak. "The Lakeview deal," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had been keeping something down with considerable effort. "My personal investment in the Lakeview deal, what's the actual exposure? What am I actually looking at?" "If the Hartfield Trust goes into indefinite hold," Raymond said, "the Lakeview financing structure loses its primary backing. The deal would need to be restructured from another source. If no alternative backing is secured within the contract window." "What's the window?" 40 days. Sal looked at Adrian. "Can we restructure it?" "We're looking at options," Adrian said. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." Sal leaned back in his chair. He put both hands flat on the table, which was a gesture Vivian would have recognized. It was what Sal did when he was about to say something he'd decided to say before he walked into the room. "We need to get her back," Sal said. The room absorbed that. "That's one option," Adrian said. "It's the only option that solves all of this at once," Sal said. "Everything Raymond just put on that board, the trust, the federal agreement, the Donovan Group, all of it runs through her. Without her, we're rebuilding from the ground up in the middle of an active federal monitoring situation. That takes time we may not have." He paused. "What happened last night was a personal matter. I understand that. But personal matters have business consequences, And right now, the business consequences of last night are sitting on that board. The room was listening very carefully. Adrian looked at Sal. Are you finished? Adrian said. Something moved through Sal's expression, not quite a flinch. The decision of a careful man not to push further in this particular direction. I'm saying what needs to be said, Sal replied. And I heard it, Adrian said. The rest of you? Vincent spoke carefully. The real estate exposure is real. We need a path forward on the Hartfield situation specifically. Whether that path involves Vivian directly or involves restructuring around her. Either way, we need movement in the next 10 days. The Nevada license matters, Davis said. We can't operate the casino property under a hold indefinitely. Tommy hadn't spoken yet. He spoke now. She knew, Tommy said. Not as a question, flatly, as a statement of fact being entered into the record. She built this thing knowing exactly what it was. And when she decided to leave, she left in a way that guaranteed we'd feel it. That's not an accident and it's not emotion. That's a strategy. The room was quiet again. So what I'm sitting with, Tommy continued, is not just that we need her cooperation. I'm sitting with the fact that a woman who has been in this organization for 17 years, who has been at every table and read every contract and managed every relationship that mattered, she left us. She made a choice. And the choice she made tells me something about what she was living with inside this house for a very long time. He looked at Adrian when he said the last part. Adrian held his gaze. I know what she was living with, Adrian said quietly. Then you know why a phone call isn't going to fix this, Tommy said. Not cruelly, just plainly. The meeting went on for another hour. At the end of it, they had a list of immediate actions and a timeline and a set of contingency structures that Raymond would begin building, none of which addressed the central problem, but all of which bought time. Time was what they had. It wasn't much. Sal left without another word to Adrian. That was noted. Selena Voss had not gone home. This was a detail that Adrian's security team discovered at 2 in the afternoon when one of the men monitoring the family's network, a standard operational precaution, flagged that Selena had attempted to access the estate's private guest Wi-Fi network from a device registered to her name. She was in the guest house, the smaller building at the rear of the estate grounds, which had its own entrance from the back road. She had a key because Adrian had given her a key 3 months ago, in a moment of what he'd considered generosity, and what he now understood was carelessness. He walked there himself rather than sending someone. The guest house was a clean, simply furnished space, 4 rooms, good bones, the kind of place that was comfortable without being decorated, which had always made it feel more honest than the main house. He let himself in through the side door and found her in the sitting room, her red gown from the night before replaced by something casual, a sweater and trousers she must have had in the small wardrobe she'd accumulated here over recent months. She was on her phone when he came in. She put it down. He stayed by the door. I told you to go home, he said. I know what you told me. Selena. I'm not one of your people, Adrian, she said. Not loudly. She was past the loudness of last night, or wherever she'd been last night with whatever she'd been feeling. She was somewhere quieter now, and the quiet was harder. You don't give me orders. You can ask me to leave. I'll decide. He looked at her. She met his eyes without wavering, and he saw something there he hadn't looked for before, because he hadn't looked. She was frightened. Not of him, specifically. Of something that had become real to her overnight, something she'd walked into without understanding, and now couldn't walk out of cleanly. What do you need? He asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it that way. The words came out before he'd processed them. She blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't that. I need to understand what I'm in the middle of, she said. Because last night, whatever I thought I was walking into, it wasn't this. I'm not stupid. I know what you do. I know what this family is. But what happened last night? She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. She walked out of that room, and within an hour, your whole organization was on fire. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen because a wife is angry. That's something she built, something she was sitting on for a long time. Yes, Adrian said. Did you know? Did you know she had that kind of... No, he said. I didn't know the extent of it. Selena looked at him steadily. That's worse, she said, that you didn't know. That she was doing all of that and you didn't see it. He had nothing to argue against that. You need to leave, he said. Not because I'm ordering you. Because staying here isn't safe for you right now. My organization is under pressure, and when this organization is under pressure, the people connected to it personally become vectors for that pressure. Do you understand what that means?" She understood. She picked up her phone from the cushion beside her and held it in both hands, looking at it as if it might tell her something useful. "Were you ever actually—" She stopped again. "What?" "In love with me. Were you actually?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "You thought you were," she said, reading the pause. "For a while. And then something changed and it got complicated, and instead of handling it, you—" She made a small gesture toward the direction of the main house. "You made it everyone else's problem." He could have argued. He didn't. "I'll have a car ready in an hour," he said. "Take whatever you have here. Don't come back to the estate." She nodded once. It wasn't agreement so much as acknowledgement. The nod of a woman who had made her own decisions and would continue to make them, but who understood that this particular chapter was finished. He left without saying anything else. Walking back to the main house across the wet gravel, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not guilt. Both of those were present and accounted for. Something older and less nameable. The feeling of looking at something you've done and not recognizing the person who did it. Inside, his phone was waiting with a message from Raymond. Naomi Cross's office called. Meeting confirmed. 8 days from now, not 10. She moved it up. He read the message twice. Vivian had moved the meeting up by 2 days. That meant something. He wasn't sure yet what it meant, but Vivian didn't do anything without it meaning something. He typed back, "Confirm it. I'll be there." The next 3 days were a specific kind of grueling that Adrian Moretti had not experienced before, because it was the kind that came not from action, but from waiting. He was a man built for action. Decisions, pressure, forward motion. He handled crises by moving toward them, but this crisis couldn't be moved toward directly. Vivian's attorney had set the terms and the timeline, and any attempt to push against them risked making things worse. And he had enough people around him telling him that the worst thing he could do right now was apply the kind of pressure he was used to applying. So he waited. And while he waited, the organization around him began to show its stress in small, incremental ways. Sal Benedetti missed a check-in meeting on the second day. Not a full absence. He sent his lieutenant instead, a man named Corso, who handled things competently enough, but whose presence in that chair instead of Sal's communicated something. Adrian noted it. He didn't address it yet. Some things needed to be observed before they were addressed. The Donovan Group's general counsel called Raymond again on the third day with additional questions about the corporate structure. Specific questions, the kind that required document production to answer. Raymond answered them as thoroughly as he could, but certain documents required Vivian's authorization to release, and that was a wall they kept running into. The Federal Monitoring Liaison, a quiet man named Bauer, who operated out of an office in Lower Manhattan and who had been managing the DOJ agreement for 4 years with a minimum of drama, called to say that he'd heard from Vivian's attorney and wanted a clarifying conversation. Raymond sat with Bauer for 2 hours. What Bauer told Raymond, calmly and without particular emotion, was that the monitoring agreement rested significantly on Vivian's personal cooperation and vouching, and that if her relationship with the organization changed materially, the agreement's basis would need to be reviewed. "Reviewed," Raymond repeated. "Reviewed," Bauer confirmed. "In what time frame?" "That would depend on what Ms. Cross's filing establishes about the nature of Miss Hale's prior involvement." Raymond brought this to Adrian. Adrian listened without expression. When Raymond finished, Adrian said, "She's not trying to expose us." "She's not actively, she's trying to extricate herself," Adrian said. "She's trying to build a clean separation. The federal review is a byproduct of that, not a weapon." Raymond considered that. "Possibly, but the outcome for us is the same." "The outcome for us depends on whether we give her reason to make it a weapon," Adrian said. Raymond was quiet. "That's why we're not pushing," Adrian said. "That's why we're waiting, because if she decided to stop being careful about the separation—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. On the fourth day, a name came back into the picture that Adrian had hoped to leave in the past. Nico Ferretti was not a member of the Moretti organization. He had been, years ago, a peripheral figure, someone who'd run money across certain borders during a period when that service was needed. He'd been paid and moved on, and the relationship had ended with a handshake that everyone involved understood meant it was over. Except that Nico Ferretti, according to an alert that came through a network contact on the fourth morning, had met with someone from Sal Benedetti's inner circle 2 days ago. A lunch, apparently. Downtown. Casual in the way meetings are casual when they're not casual at all. Adrian read the alert 3 times. Then he called Tommy Ricci. "Nico Ferretti," he said. Tommy was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a man who already knows. "I heard. Did you hear about the lunch?" "Yesterday." "You didn't tell me." "I was verifying," Tommy said. "I didn't want to bring you something unverified." "And now?" "It's verified," Tommy said. "Corso was there too, Sal's man." Adrian stood at his window. The garden was empty today. No groundskeeper. The wind had picked up again, and the leaves were going everywhere they wanted. "Sal is having conversations he hasn't told me about," Adrian said. "Yes." "With a man who has historical access to certain operational details of this organization." "Yes," Tommy said again. He let the silence do the work. "He's looking for a position," Adrian said. "In case this resolves badly, he's looking for somewhere to land." "That's what it looks like." Adrian breathed through his nose slowly. "How many others?" "I don't know yet. I'm working on it." "How many do you suspect?" A pause. "Sal has relationships with at least 3 other families that I know of. If he's moving, he's not moving alone. People don't move alone when they're trying to position." Adrian set his jaw. This was the secondary crisis, the one that fed on the first one's disruption. The loyalty structure of an organization like his ran on confidence. Confidence that the organization was stable, that leadership was decisive, that uncertainty was temporary. The moment stability came into question, the opportunist started taking meetings. He should have expected it. He had expected it, somewhere at the back of his mind. He simply hadn't expected it to move this fast. "Keep watching," Adrian said. "Don't confront anything yet. I want the full picture before anything moves." "Understood." "And Tommy," he paused, "thank you for verifying before you brought it." Tommy made a small sound, not quite acknowledgement, not quite dismissal. The sound of a man who'd been doing this long enough to know when thanks were warranted and when they were just words. On the 6th day, Selena Voss gave an interview. Not to a major outlet, not a press conference, a small conversation with a journalist she apparently knew, someone who wrote about New York's social world for a publication that existed in the specific stratum between gossip and serious coverage. The interview appeared online in the morning. She hadn't said much. She was too smart to say much. But what she'd said, wrapped in the careful language of a woman who understood liability, was enough. She'd confirmed that she and Adrian Moretti had been in a relationship. She'd described the public introduction at the party as something that had been, in her phrasing, more complicated than it appeared. She'd said, when asked about Vivian, that she had enormous respect for women who know their own worth. It was a small thing. In another context, it would have been nothing. In this context, it landed like a match near something flammable. Because the story of the Moretti party, the mistress, the wife who'd walked out, had already been traveling through certain circles the way these stories always traveled. Word of mouth, secondhand accounts, the whisper network of people who knew people who'd been in that ballroom. The interview gave it a hook, made it something that could be written about, made it something that existed on a page rather than just in the air. By noon, Raymond had 3 calls from people asking if the family wanted to respond. Adrian said no. But the damage was different now. The damage had moved from the financial and legal world, where it could theoretically be contained, into a softer, harder-to-manage territory. The territory of public perception. These were things the Moretti organization managed carefully. It always had. The family's public identity was something Vivian had helped construct and maintain. The right charitable donations, the right affiliations, the right distance from anything that smelled like what they actually were. That careful image was now developing cracks, and Vivian, who would have known exactly how to manage it, was not there to manage it. Selena, to her credit or her strategy, had not mentioned money or business. She had not given anyone anything actionable, but she had confirmed a reality, and reality, once confirmed publicly, takes on a weight of its own. Adrian read the interview twice, set his phone face down on his desk. walked to his filing cabinet, pulled out a folder he'd had for years, a folder he'd always told himself was leverage, was insurance, was something he was keeping because a careful man kept things. Inside it were documents, financial records mostly, corporate filings, some correspondence. What they proved, these documents, was something specific, that over the course of 12 years, several major victories of the Moretti organization, acquisitions, regulatory clearances, banking relationships, had been achieved through Vivian's work, her strategy, her relationships, and then recorded in ways that attributed those victories to the organization's leadership without naming her. He had done that deliberately, not out of malice, or so he'd told himself, out of the need to maintain a certain kind of authority. Men in his position did not have wives who outperformed them. It created complications. It created narratives he couldn't control. So he'd controlled the narrative in the only way available to him. He'd erased her from the record of her own achievements. He stood with the folder in his hands. He'd pulled it out because part of him, the part that was still Adrian Moretti, still the man who protected himself above everything, had thought about using it. Using the existence of those records to create some kind of position for the meeting in 8 days, some kind of leverage. He stood there for a long time. Then he put the folder in his briefcase. Not to use it as leverage, he wasn't entirely sure yet what for, but he put it in the briefcase and he closed the clasp and he sat back down at his desk and he thought about what kind of man he had been and what kind of man was still possible. On the morning of the 7th day, he got a call from an outside number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't pick up. His protocol was to screen unknowns. But something made him answer. Mr. Moretti. A woman's voice, controlled, professional, with the slight edge of someone who chose every word before it left her mouth. This is Naomi Cross. He said nothing for a moment. Ms. Cross. I'm calling outside of our scheduled channels because something has changed and I thought you deserved to know directly rather than through your attorney. His spine straightened. What's changed? My client has been approached, Naomi Cross said, by a representative of the Benedetti family. Not Sal Benedetti himself, a contact of his. This person reached out to Vivian through a mutual acquaintance and offered her, I'll use the word loosely, assistance. Adrian felt something go cold in his chest. What kind of assistance? The kind that comes with strings, Cross said. They're aware of her legal position. They're aware of the financial leverage she holds. And they've suggested to her, in carefully worded terms, that there might be interest in certain circles in acquiring that leverage. Acquiring it, which meant paying for it, which meant Sal, or someone connected to Sal, was trying to buy Vivian's position, her legal control over the Moretti financial structure, out from under Adrian and turn it into a weapon. She refused, Cross said, immediately and clearly. But I'm telling you this because you need to understand the landscape you're operating in before tomorrow's meeting. Tomorrow. He checked. The meeting had been moved again, from 8 days to 7. Vivian moved it up, Cross confirmed, to tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., the address Raymond Chu has on file. What changed? The Benedetti approach changed it, Cross said. My client's position is that the window for resolution needs to close before external parties are able to create additional complications. If you're going to address this, it has to be now. She ended the call. Adrian stood in the middle of his study with his phone still in his hand, his chest tight with something that wasn't just the crisis. It was the picture the crisis was drawing, the picture of his own organization moving against him, and the picture of a woman who'd been approached by his enemies and had refused them, and then called her attorney and moved the meeting up, because even now, in everything she was doing to separate herself from him, she was choosing not to make things worse than they had to be. He called Raymond. Get me there at 9, he said, whatever it takes. You'll be there, Raymond said. And Raymond, he paused. I need you to reach out to Sal Benedetti tonight. Tell him I'm aware of the approach his people made. Don't threaten, just tell him I know. A pause. That will? I know what it'll do, Adrian said. Do it anyway. He ended the call and stood for a moment in the center of the room. Then he opened his briefcase and took out the folder, the one with the 12 years of records, the documents that erased Vivian's name from her own victories. And he held it in his hands and thought about what it was and what it meant that he'd kept it, and what it would mean to do something different with it than what he'd originally imagined. He was still standing there when the light shifted and he realized an hour had passed. Outside, the wind had stopped for the first time in days. and the leaves were where they'd fallen, still, and the garden was quiet in a way that felt less like peace than like the silence before something that cannot be taken back. The address Raymond had on file was not a law office. It was a conference suite on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown that Naomi Cross's firm rented for sensitive meetings, the kind of meetings that needed to happen on neutral ground, in a space that belonged to no one and could be vacated cleanly afterward. Adrian had been in rooms like it before. They were designed to feel temporary, which was the point. Nothing that happened in a temporary room felt quite as permanent as it actually was. He arrived at 8:52. Raymond was with him. One other man, his personal security, a quiet individual named Brent, who had been with Adrian for 9 years and understood that certain rooms required him to stay outside the door. Brent stayed outside the door. The suite had a long table, 8 chairs, water pitchers, and 3 windows facing north that showed a compressed cross-section of the city, glass and steel and the gray October sky sitting on top of everything like a lid. Adrian took the chair on the east side of the table, second from the end. He didn't take the head. He'd considered it and decided against it. This was not his room. Naomi Cross arrived at 8:58 with 2 associates who set up laptops and a document stack, and then sat very still at the far end of the table, the way people sit when their job is to watch and record rather than participate. Cross herself was 50-something, compact, with the kind of presence that didn't raise its voice because it had never needed to. She shook Adrian's hand without warmth and without hostility, the handshake of a professional who had no personal feelings about him and intended to keep it that way. "Mr. Moretti," she said. "Ms. Cross." She sat across from Raymond. She opened a folder. She did not look at the door. Adrian did. At 9:03, the door opened. Vivian entered the room. She was wearing a white suit, not bright white, the off-white of something expensive and understated, the color of paper that hasn't been written on yet. Her hair was down, which was unusual for a meeting like this, and it made her look simultaneously younger and more serious than the ballroom version of herself that Adrian's brain kept defaulting to. She carried nothing in her hands. No folder, no phone, no bag. Whatever she needed was already in the room or already in her head. She looked at Adrian once, directly, and he looked back, and something passed between them that Raymond and Naomi Cross and the 2 associates all felt without being able to name, the specific current that moves between people who have shared 17 years of a life and are now sitting across a table from each other with attorneys present. Then she sat down. "Thank you for moving the timeline, Ceci," Naomi Cross said to Adrian's side of the table. Raymond nodded. "We appreciate the call yesterday. The Benedetti situation." "My client's interest is in a clean resolution," Cross said. "External interference doesn't serve that." "We're aligned on that," Raymond said. Adrian had said nothing. He was watching Vivian, who was watching the table's surface with the focused attention of someone running through a prepared sequence in her mind, making sure she was where she intended to be, feeling what she intended to feel. He recognized the behavior because he'd seen it in her before important negotiations. She did this. She went inside herself for 30 seconds, and then she came back ready. She came back. She looked at him. "You know why we're here," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "Then let's not take longer than we need to." She glanced at Cross, who nodded and opened the document stack. What followed for the next 40 minutes was the most precise dismantling Adrian Moretti had ever sat through. Cross walked through every financial instrument, every corporate structure, every legal agreement that Vivian had built, maintained, or guaranteed over 17 years. She walked through it the way a surgeon walks through an anatomy, without sentiment, naming each piece for what it was, explaining its function, and then explaining what happened to the whole body when that piece was removed or modified. It was, Adrian thought, an extraordinary thing to witness. Not because the information was new. Raymond had given him most of it, but because hearing it assembled in sequence, in this room, with Vivian sitting across from him, made the actual scale of what she'd built impossible to look away from. She hadn't just managed the legitimate side. She had architected it. The entire legal and financial identity of the Moretti organization's above-ground life, the thing that let it exist in the world as something other than a criminal enterprise, was a structure she had designed and inhabited and maintained. Cross set a single document in front of Adrian. "This is what my client is proposing," Cross said. Adrian picked it up. Raymond leaned in. They read. The proposal was not a negotiation in the usual sense. It didn't have a list of demands and counteroffers and room to maneuver. It had terms. Specific, non-negotiable terms, written in the language of someone who had thought very carefully about what was sufficient and what was excessive and had landed on sufficient. Every financial operation Vivian had managed would undergo independent oversight going forward. She would not be removed from the structures immediately. A sudden removal would destabilize things in ways that hurt everyone. But she would transition out over an 18-month period during which genuine alternatives would be built with her guidance and cooperation. Her assets, her legal identity, her name would not be used for any organizational purpose without her written, witnessed, and time-stamped authorization. The DOJ monitoring agreement would be preserved and she would continue to cooperate with it, but that cooperation was contingent on the organization's full compliance with every term in this document. And there was a final clause. The final clause was 2 sentences. Adrian read them twice. He looked up at Vivian. The trust accounts, he said. Yes, she said. The trust accounts were a set of financial instruments that existed entirely outside the organization's structure. Personal accounts, old family money, investments. Vivian had made over 20 years using capital from her own inheritance and her own financial work. They were hers, legally and unambiguously. The final clause simply stated that these accounts, and the business entity she intended to create using them, would operate entirely independently of the Moretti organization, and that the organization would acknowledge in writing that it had no claim, no interest, and no standing in relation to them. It was the door she was building for herself. The exit. This gives you what you need to leave, Adrian said. That's correct, Vivian said. And it keeps the organization stable while you go. That's also correct. I'm not trying to destroy it. I'm trying to separate from it cleanly. She paused. The 2 things can both be true. He looked at the document for a moment longer. Then he set it down. He hadn't planned what happened next. Or maybe he had. In the way you plan something you can't quite bring yourself to call a plan. A decision that lives in you for days before you name it. He reached down and opened his briefcase. He put the folder on the table. The folder with the 12 years of records. The documents that showed her name removed from her own work. The internal memos, the corporate filings, the correspondence, all of it, the accumulated evidence of what he'd done. He pushed it across the table to her. She looked at it. She didn't touch it yet. What is this? She said. Not a question. A statement waiting to become one. The record, he said, the real one. Every acquisition, every regulatory clearance, every banking relationship that you built or secured or negotiated. I had your name removed from the official record. I kept these. He paused. I kept them as insurance. I'm giving them to you because they're yours. Naomi Cross was very still. Vivian looked at the folder. She put one hand on it. She didn't open it. You've had this the whole time, she said. Yes. You kept documentation proving that I was responsible for a significant portion of the organization's legal victories. Yes. And you kept it because I'm a man who keeps things that might be useful. He said it flatly, without decoration. And because some part of me knew, even when I was erasing your name, that what I was doing was wrong. And keeping the record was the only, I don't have a better word for it, the only honest thing I allowed myself. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. She opened the folder. She looked at the first page, the second. She turned them slowly, the way she turned pages when she was reading carefully, absorbing rather than scanning. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something moved through it. Not surprise, because he didn't think she was surprised. Something older than surprise. The specific pain of having a thing you already knew confirmed in writing. She closed the folder. She looked at him. You diminished me, she said. Her voice was level. Not loud, not broken, not performatively calm. Just true. Systematically. For years. Because acknowledging what I actually did would have made you feel smaller. He held her gaze. Yes. And you're giving me this now because it's yours, he said, and because I'm done pretending the version of events that made me look sufficient. The room was extremely quiet. Raymond was looking at the table. Cross was looking at Vivian. The 2 associates had stopped typing. Vivian sat with the folder under her hand and looked at her husband. her almost former husband, across the width of a table in a temporary room in Midtown, and she let herself feel what she felt, which was complicated and layered and not any single thing that could be named cleanly. Then the door opened. It wasn't a knock. The door opened, and the young associate who'd been stationed outside, one of Cross's people, a man Adrian didn't know, stepped in and leaned down to Cross's ear and said something in a voice too low for the rest of the room. Cross's expression changed. It changed in the specific way that expressions change when something is happening that changes the geometry of the room. She looked at Vivian. "He's here." Vivian's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Here, as in, downstairs, the lobby. He came to the building." Adrian looked between them. "Who?" Cross looked at him then, with the measured look of someone deciding how much to release. She released enough. "Sal Benedetti," she said. The word hit the room like a change in air pressure. Adrian's eyes went to Raymond. Raymond's face was doing the calculation. "We told him you knew about the approach," Raymond said. "Last night, like you said." "And he came here," Adrian said. "He must have had the building under watch," Raymond said. "He'd have seen the car." Adrian stood up. "Adrian," Vivian's voice. He stopped. He turned back. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen in a long time. Not warm, not forgiving, not any of the things it might have been in another version of this story. But direct, present, real. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. "If you go down there, you make it worse," she said. "Whatever he's here for, a confrontation, an escalation, something to destabilize this meeting. You give it to him if you move. You stay in this room." "He came to this building. I know where he came," she said. "Sit down." He sat. Cross was on her phone quietly. Her associate had retreated to the doorway. Raymond was looking at Adrian with the expression of a man who recognized that he was witnessing something he hadn't predicted. Vivian looked at Cross. "Can we move this along?" "Yes," Cross said, still on the phone, managing two things simultaneously with the ease of someone accustomed to it. "Yes, send him away. Tell him the meeting is private and he's not expected. If he doesn't go, call building security." She ended the call, looked at the room. "Let's continue." They continued. But the air in the room had changed. Sal's arrival downstairs was not an accident, and everyone in the room knew it. It was a message, possibly to Adrian, possibly to Vivian, possibly to both. The message was, "I know where you are, and I have interests in what happens here." The message was, "This is not only your negotiation." The terms continued on paper. Adrian signed where he was directed to sign. Raymond countersigned. The organizational commitments were laid out and accepted, one by one, with the grinding patience of a legal process that cannot be hurried because hurrying it creates vulnerabilities. And while this happened, while Adrian's pen moved across line after line of Vivian's terms, his mind was in two places. One was here, in this room, with this document, doing the thing that needed to be done. The other was downstairs in a lobby where Sal Benedetti had come to assert a presence, and who had now been sent away, and who would not accept being sent away easily. They finished at 11:40. Cross assembled the signed documents. Her associates began packing. Raymond organized his copies. Vivian stood and picked up the folder, the real record, the one with her name on her own work, and held it against her chest. "One more thing," she said. She was looking at Adrian. He waited. "The people who approached me on Sal's behalf," she said, "I want you to know that I made a record of that approach. What was offered, how it was framed, who made the contact. My attorney has it. I'm not going to use it unless something forces me to. But it exists." He understood what she was saying. She was giving him information he needed to handle his own house, and she was also telling him that if his house became a problem for her, she had protection. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face, the faintest suggestion of something that wasn't softness but was adjacent to it. The look of a person who has decided that being decent costs less than they thought it would. Then she walked to the door and left. Adrian sat in the chair for 30 seconds after she'd gone. He was aware of Raymond watching him. He was aware of the empty chair across the table and the water glasses and the gray sky outside the north windows. He stood up. "Get me Sal Benedetti," he said. "Today. In person." Raymond nodded. And get me everything you have on Nico Ferretti's current operations, Adrian said. Everything. Whatever he's been doing, whatever he's been building, I want to understand who he is right now, not who he was. He picked up his briefcase. He looked at the table one more time. The water glasses, the indentations where pens had rested, the temporary room that had witnessed something permanent. He walked out. The confrontation with Sal Benedetti happened at 3 in the afternoon in the back room of a restaurant in Carroll Gardens that the Moretti organization owned through a shell company and used for conversations that needed walls around them. Sal arrived 7 minutes late, not because he was running behind. Sal Benedetti was never running behind. He arrived late because arriving late to this particular meeting was its own statement, and Sal was a man who made statements through behavior rather than words whenever he could. He sat down across from Adrian without apologizing. He poured himself water from the carafe on the table. He was 61 years old, heavy-set in the way of a man who had once been muscular and had let the muscle redistribute over years of restaurant meals. His hands were very steady. That was the thing about Sal. His hands were always steady, which told you that whatever was happening in his head, he'd separated it from his body long ago. "You came to the building," Adrian said. "I wanted to know how it was going," Sal said. "You could have called." "I was in the neighborhood." Adrian looked at him. Sal met the look. He didn't shift. He didn't adjust his posture or soften the eye contact or do any of the small physical things people do when they're uncomfortable. He held it the way a man holds something heavy that he's been holding for long enough that the weight feels normal. "The Benedetti approach to Vivian," Adrian said. "Walk me through that." Sal set down his water glass. "I don't know what you mean." "You know what I mean." "I know what Raymond told you I mean," Sal said. "That's different from what I actually did." "Then correct me." Sal was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, then back up. "I made a business inquiry," he said, "through appropriate channels. I wanted to understand what Vivian's intentions were regarding the financial structures. I had personal exposure in the Lakeview deal. I had a right to that information. You approached my wife through a back channel. Your estranged wife," Sal said, calmly, not cruelly, just factually, "who is currently operating independently and who has significant leverage over assets that affect multiple parties in this organization, not just you. You went around me. You weren't answering the relevant questions," Sal said. His voice stayed even. "You were answering the personal questions, the organizational questions, the ones that affect my money, my people, my commitments. Those weren't getting answered, so I sought answers." Adrian leaned forward slightly, just slightly. "You sought answers from a woman you were simultaneously trying to buy." Something shifted in Sal's expression then, just a thread of something. Not guilt. Men like Sal had evolved past guilt as a functional emotion. But acknowledgement. The flicker of a man who'd been caught being more than he'd represented. "I floated a possibility," Sal said. "An offer of support, financial and otherwise, for her transition, in exchange for her cooperation with you," Adrian said. "In exchange for using the legal control she holds over my organization to benefit you instead." Sal didn't answer. "Say it," Adrian said. Say what you actually did." "I protected my interests," Sal said. "The way I've always protected my interests. The way every man in this organization protects his interests. Don't lecture me about loyalty, Adrian. Not this week." The restaurant was empty except for them and two of Adrian's men who stood by the door. The kitchen was quiet. The afternoon light came through the high windows in flat slabs that illuminated the dust in the air and nothing else. "You've been with Nico Ferretti," Adrian said. Sal's jaw tightened. "Nico's an old acquaintance. He's an old acquaintance with current operational capacity and historical knowledge of this organization's weaker structures," Adrian said. "And you've been having lunch with him while my financial framework is in crisis. So I'm going to ask you directly, Sal, because we've known each other long enough that I think you owe me a direct answer. Are you positioning to move against this organization, or are you positioning to survive a version of events where this organization changes shape?" Sal looked at him for a long time. "Those aren't different things," Sal finally said. The words hit with the particular force of a truth delivered without drama. Adrian absorbed them. "Then we both know where we are," he said. "We both know where we are," Sal confirmed. He picked up his water glass again. His hands were still steady. "The question is what you're going to do about it." "The question," Adrian said, is what you think this organization is going to look like in 60 days, and whether the version of it you're planning for is one you built or one you survived. Sal considered that. Is that a threat? No, Adrian said. It's an offer. That landed differently. He saw it land. The slight recalibration behind Sal's eyes, the shift from defensive positioning to something more cautious and alert. I'm listening, Sal said. The organization is changing, Adrian said. He hadn't planned to say it this way, in this room, to this man, before he'd said it to anyone else. But Sal was in front of him, and the moment was real, and some things became true the first time you said them out loud. What I signed this morning with Vivian's attorney starts a process, an oversight structure, a governing model that distributes decision-making rather than concentrating it in one chair. It's going to look different than what it's looked like. Sal was very still. That's what the Moretti organization is becoming, Adrian continued. Whether you're a part of that or not is your decision. But I need to know now, because I can't have people inside this organization who are already building exits in other directions. Sal sat with that for a full 10 seconds. You signed the terms, he said. Every one of them. The oversight, the transparency. Yes. That's not who you are, Sal said. Not accusingly. Almost, if anything, with something like wonder. Like a man looking at a landscape that's rearranged itself overnight. It's what I have to become, Adrian said. Another silence. If the organization changes like you're describing, Sal said slowly, the Lakeview deal can still be structured, differently, through the new framework. I'll look at it, Adrian said. No promises. But I'll look. Sal nodded, once, slowly. Nico Ferretti was a contingency, Sal said. I'll close that off. Today, Adrian said. Today, Sal confirmed. Adrian stood. Sal stood. They didn't shake hands. It wasn't that kind of agreement. It was the kind you made with eye contact in an empty restaurant in the afternoon. And it was the kind that held not because of warmth, but because both men understood the alternative. Sal left first. Adrian stayed for 5 minutes after he left, standing at the window, watching the street outside. Carroll Gardens in October, a woman walking a small dog, 2 men talking on a stoop, the ordinary life of a city that continued its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the negotiations happening inside its buildings. He pulled out his phone. He looked at it for a moment. He called Tommy Ricci. It's done, he said. Sal is contained for now, but I need you to watch Nico Ferretti directly, not through intermediaries, your people, eyes on him. Done, Tommy said. What happened in the meeting this morning with Vivian? I signed, Adrian said. A pause. Everything? Every term. Another pause, longer. How is she? The question surprised him, not because it was inappropriate. Tommy had known Vivian for 12 years, had sat at her dinner table, had trusted her instincts on more than one occasion when she'd offered them quietly and without fanfare. But because it was a human question in the middle of a series of operational ones, and Adrian hadn't expected it. He started. He thought about the white suit and the folder and the way she'd told him to sit down. She's exactly who she always was, he said. I just wasn't looking. Tommy was quiet for a moment. What happens now? He asked. Now I figure out who I have to be, Adrian said. He ended the call. He stood in the empty restaurant for another minute. The flat light through the windows had shifted while he'd been standing there. The afternoon moving, the angle changing, the dust in the air catching it differently. He thought about the folder he'd given Vivian, the 12 years of records, the documentation of her erased victories. He thought about what it had felt like to push it across that table toward her rather than use it for something else. And he tried to identify the specific sensation that action had produced in him, something between relief and loss and the strange vertigo of doing an irrevocable thing. He thought about Selena Voss, who was somewhere in this city right now, living her own life, managing whatever the interview fallout had brought her, moving forward through whatever version of events she was constructing for herself. He thought about the woman with the small dog on the street below. He thought about the groundskeeper raking leaves in wind that undid everything. He thought about Sal's words. Those aren't different things. Positioning to move against the organization. Positioning to survive what it becomes. Not different. He breathed in the still restaurant air. He thought about what it meant to change, not because you chose to, but because you'd run out of alternatives, and then found, somewhere in the middle of having no choice, that the thing you had no choice but to do was also, possibly, the right thing. He wasn't sure that made it redemption. He wasn't sure he deserved to call it that. But he walked to the door and opened it and went out into the street, and the October air hit him cold and direct and without ceremony, and the city moved around him the way cities move around individual men, completely, indifferently, continuously. And he turned and walked north toward whatever the next thing was. He didn't know yet that the next thing was already in motion. He didn't know that in an office on the 44th floor of a building 12 blocks north, Naomi Cross was on a call with a federal contact, not Bauer, someone above Bauer, who had questions that went beyond the monitoring agreement. Questions that had been sitting in a file for 4 years. Questions that no one had asked while Vivian's cooperation had made them unnecessary. And he didn't know that the reason those questions were now moving from the file to the phone call was not Cross's doing, and not Vivian's, and not the DOJ's independent initiative. The reason was a document that had been submitted to the Southern District anonymously. A document with financial records spanning 12 years. Records that showed Vivian's name removed from the Moretti organization's greatest legal victories, which meant someone had leaked it, which meant someone who had seen that folder, or had known about it, had known what was in it, had access to the information it contained, had taken that information somewhere it would do maximum damage. Raymond would find out by 6 o'clock. He would call Adrian at 6:04, and Adrian would stand in his study in the Moretti estate and hold his phone and understand in one cold and total moment that the folder he had given to Vivian in that conference room as an act of honesty, the folder with her name on her own erased work, was now in the hands of the federal government, and that whoever had leaked it had done so with a precision that suggested they had known exactly what they were doing and had been waiting for exactly this moment. He would understand something else, too. Something that came to him not as a thought but as a physical sensation. A dropping in the chest, a tightening across the shoulders. In the 4 seconds between Raymond saying the words and Adrian being able to form a response. The only people who had known what was in that folder were himself, and the person he'd given it to, and one other person. One person who had been in that room, who had watched the folder cross the table, who had understood immediately what it contained, who had the intelligence and the motive and the long-standing resentment to recognize exactly what a 12-year record of erased victories could accomplish in the right hands. He would stand in his study at 6:04 in the evening of the most pivotal day of his life, and he would understand that he had been outmaneuvered. Not by an enemy, not by a rival family, not by the federal government, or Naomi Cross, or Sal Benedetti, or Nico Ferretti. By the one person in that room who had every reason in the world, and who had said nothing, and who had simply waited and acted in the specific quiet way of someone who had spent 17 years learning exactly how and when and where to move. Raymond's call came in at 6:04 and lasted 9 minutes. Adrian stood in the center of his study and did not sit down for any of those 9 minutes. He stood the way a man stands when sitting would feel like surrender. Legs slightly apart, one hand holding the phone against his ear, the other pressed flat against the surface of his desk, feeling the wood grain under his palm like it was something to hold on to. Raymond spoke carefully. He always spoke carefully when the information was dangerous, choosing each word the way you choose each step on uncertain ground. The federal contact, the document submission, the anonymous source, the Southern District file that had been sitting dormant for 4 years and was now, as of this afternoon, active. Adrian listened without interrupting. When Raymond finished, Adrian said, "Who was in the room?" "Adrian? Name them. Everyone who was in that room when I gave her the folder." Raymond named them. "Vivian, Naomi Cross. 2 associates. Raymond himself." "Raymond," Adrian said, "you've been with me for 11 years. Yes. You didn't do this." "No." "Then there are 4 other people, and one of them took what was in that folder and put it in front of the Southern District." Raymond was quiet. "The associates are Cross's people. They'd have no—" "Cross herself," Adrian said. "She's bound by attorney-client privilege. If she leaked a document from her own client meeting, not Cross," Adrian said. He already knew it wasn't Cross. Cross was too careful, too professional, too invested in her own reputation to set a fire in her own client's house. That leaves 2. Silence on the line. You think Vivian? Raymond started. I don't know what I think, Adrian said. Get me everything that document contained. Every page. I need to know exactly what was submitted. That'll take tonight, Raymond. He ended the call. He stood at his desk for 3 full minutes after that, not moving. His hand was still flat against the wood. He was aware of his own breathing, slower than it should be, the deliberate breathing of a man forcing his body not to react faster than his mind could manage. He thought about the moment in the conference room, the folder crossing the table, Vivian's hand on it, the way she'd opened it slowly, turned the pages, her face. He thought about what her face had looked like. Not shock, not calculation. He'd been watching her face because he'd been watching her face for 17 years, and he could read it the way you read something in your own language, instinctively, without translation. And what he'd seen when she opened that folder was pain, real pain, the kind that comes when something you already knew becomes something you're holding in your hands. That was not the face of a person executing a plan. But then, he thought about the other thing. He thought about Naomi Cross's associate, the young man who'd come to the door and whispered that Sal was downstairs. He thought about the way everyone in the room had been momentarily distracted, the way attention had shifted toward the door, toward Cross's phone call, toward the logistics of managing an unexpected intrusion. He thought about how long that distraction had lasted. Long enough for someone to photograph a folder, long enough for someone to use a phone. He called Tommy Ricci. I need the building's security footage, he said. The conference suite on the 31st floor. This morning, between 9 and noon. I need it in the next 2 hours. That's a private building, Tommy said. I don't have... Find someone who does, Adrian said. 2 hours, Tommy. He ended the call. He went to the window. The estate grounds were fully dark now, the garden lights doing their dim work, the Manhattan skyline burning orange and white on the horizon. He looked at it the way he'd looked at it 1,000 nights. The skyline he'd told himself he'd helped build, in his own way, through his own version of empire. He'd believed that. Had believed in the fundamental justness of it, the earned quality of what he had. He wasn't sure what he believed right now. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Vivian. He picked up. I know, she said immediately. No greeting, no preamble. Her voice was tight in the specific way of someone managing something at the edge of what they can manage. I know what happened. Naomi called me 20 minutes ago. Did you do it? He said. A pause. 1 second, maybe 2. No, she said. He breathed. Do you believe me? She said. He thought about her face in the conference room, the pain that wasn't performance. Yes, he said. She exhaled. The sound of it told him she'd been holding that breath. Then we have a problem, she said, because whoever did this used the content of that folder, your folder, the one you gave me, and submitted it in a way that implicates both of us. The document doesn't distinguish between what you did and what I knew. From the federal perspective, we were both part of the same structure. I know, he said. Naomi is working to establish my immunity position tonight, she said. But Adrian, the document that was submitted has details in it that suggest the source understood exactly how to frame it. The framing is surgical. It's not just damaging to you. It's specifically designed to make my cooperation with the organization look willing and strategic, not coerced, he said. Or simply marital, she said. Whoever did this wanted to close my exit door, wanted to make it look like I was an active participant, not a person trying to get out cleanly, he said. Yes, she said. He thought about that framing. Surgical, the word she'd used. Someone who understood exactly how to arrange the information to do maximum damage to maximum people. Someone who understood the organization. Someone who had a reason to close Vivian's exit. Someone who had been in that room or had known what was in that folder. He thought about Sal's words in the restaurant. Those aren't different things. Positioning to move against the organization or survive its transformation. The same thing. He thought about the anonymous submission, the Southern District, the file that had been dormant for 4 years. Vivian, he said, the approach Benedetti's people made to you, the offer of support in exchange for cooperation. You said you had a record of it. Yes. What form is that record in? A pause. A written account. Dates, names, what was said. Naomi has it. Is there anything else? Any digital record? A message? An email? Anything from their side? She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, the specific quality of her silence when she was processing rather than composing. There's a text message, she said slowly, from the contact who reached out. It came from an unknown number, but the content is specific enough that, send it to Raymond tonight, he said. Right now, before anything else. Why? Because I think the person who submitted that document to the Southern District is the same person who approached you, he said. And I think they submitted it not to destroy me and not to destroy you. They submitted it to create chaos, to destabilize the meeting, destabilize the agreement, and position themselves to move into the vacuum. She was quiet. Sal, she said. Sal, he confirmed. Another silence, longer. He was downstairs, she said, this morning, in the lobby. His people knew we were meeting, he said. They knew what building, if they had someone on Cross's associate. He stopped. It doesn't matter right now how it happened. What matters is we have about 12 hours before the Southern District formalizes the inquiry and we lose control of the sequence entirely. What do you need? She said. It was such a simple question, 4 words. And what struck him, standing in his study in the dark, was that she'd asked it at all. That after everything, after the ballroom and the folder and the legal dismantling and the 17 years of being erased, she was still asking what he needed. I need you to trust me for one more night, he said. The pause this time was different, longer, weighted. That's not a small thing to ask, she said. I know. If I trust you and you're wrong, I know, he said again. She breathed. Send me what you need from Raymond, she said. I'll make my decisions from there. She ended the call. He called Raymond back immediately. He talked fast. Raymond, to his credit, asked only the questions that needed asking and took the rest on faith. The faith of 11 years of working beside someone and understanding how they moved. By 7:30, Raymond had 3 things. The security footage request submitted to a building contact, the text message forwarded from Vivian's phone, and a preliminary map of Sal Benedetti's communications network over the past 72 hours. That last one came from Tommy Ricci, who had been building it quietly since Adrian's call that morning, because Tommy Ricci was the kind of man who worked ahead of instructions. Adrian drove to Tommy's place himself. He didn't bring Brent or anyone else. He drove the 40 minutes to a house in Westchester that Tommy had lived in for 20 years and pulled into the driveway and knocked on the door like a person who was visiting, which is what it would have looked like to anyone watching. Tommy opened the door in a flannel shirt, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the specific look of a man who'd been working at home for the past 3 hours in the particular concentrated way you work when you know something is coming. He stood back and let Adrian in. The kitchen table had 3 laptops and a coffee mug and a yellow legal pad covered in Tommy's compact handwriting. A map of sorts. Names, arrows, question marks, dates. Adrian sat down at the table. Tommy sat across from him and turned the legal pad so Adrian could see it. Sal's been moving since last week, Tommy said. He didn't waste time on preamble. The lunch with Nico Ferretti was the visible part. What I've been able to piece together in the last 8 hours. This is mostly inference, I want to be clear about that. Inference from pattern. Go ahead, Adrian said. Sal has had contact with the Maranzano people, Tommy said. He put his finger on a name on the pad. Not the old guard Maranzanos. The Sun's operation. Younger, hungrier, been trying to expand their footprint for 3 years. They've been waiting for a moment of instability in this organization for a while. And Sal offered them one, Adrian said. I think he offered them information, Tommy said. Access to the financial structure, the knowledge of how it works, where the vulnerabilities are, who controls what. That's worth money to the Maranzanos, even if they never use it directly. And the submission to the Southern District, Adrian said. Tommy looked at him steadily. That's the part I can't prove yet. But the timing is the proof, Adrian said. The timing and the framing. Someone who understood how to structure that submission to create maximum damage to the monitoring agreement specifically. That's someone with operational knowledge. Nico Ferretti has it. Sal has it. He paused. The 2 of them together have enough. Adrian looked at the legal pad, the names, the arrows, the particular chaos of a map drawn by a man trying to make order from moving parts. If we bring this to the Southern District ourselves, Adrian said, Sal's approach to Vivian, the text message, the connection to Nico and the Maranzano contact, can we establish that the anonymous submission was an act of interference in an active legal proceeding? Tommy considered that carefully. That's a federal argument, he said. That requires someone who knows how to make it. Cross, Adrian said. Vivian's attorney. Tommy raised an eyebrow, just slightly. You're going to ask Vivian's attorney to go to bat for you. I'm going to ask her to go to bat for the truth, Adrian said, which includes the fact that her client is being deliberately implicated in a scheme designed to destabilize her exit from the organization. He paused. That serves Vivian. Cross will do it for that reason. Tommy was quiet for a moment. You're moving fast, he said. I have 12 hours. Less, maybe. Then I have less. Tommy poured coffee from a pot on the counter that had been there long enough to be approximate rather than good. He handed Adrian a cup. Adrian drank it without tasting it. The family council, Tommy said. You're going to need to address them, tonight or first thing tomorrow. Whatever happens with the Southern District, the internal situation needs to be handled internally first. You can't have Sal operating in the way he's been operating and then walk into a federal proceeding looking like you have a unified house. I know. Addressing the council means confronting Sal in front of everyone, Tommy said. That's not going to be a quiet conversation. I know, Adrian said. He'll come back at you. I'm counting on it, Adrian said. He looked at Tommy. I need him to make his move in front of witnesses. I need the council to see it. Whatever he's been building behind closed doors needs to happen in the open, where everyone can name it for what it is. Tommy looked at him steadily for a long moment. You're using yourself as bait, Tommy said. I'm using the meeting as the ground, Adrian said. If he's going to move, I want him to move in a room where I control the walls. Tommy drank his coffee, set it down. All right, he said. Call the council, Adrian said. Emergency session, 10 o'clock tonight, the estate. That's 3 hours. Then we'd better move. Tommy was already reaching for his phone. The council assembled at 10:17. Not everyone arrived at 10. Some of them had to travel. Some of them had to be found. Some of them came with the cautious body language of men who'd received an emergency summons at 9 in the evening and had spent the drive over constructing theories about what it meant. But by 10:17, 7 men were seated in the estate's formal meeting room. And the formal meeting room was the kind of space that communicated, by its architecture alone, that whatever was about to happen was being handled as a serious matter. Adrian stood at the head of the table. Sal was at the far end. Sal had come, which confirmed something. A guilty man with good instincts sometimes doesn't come. Sal was there because staying away would have told its own story, and because he was calculating that whatever Adrian had, it wasn't enough, and that showing up was still the stronger position. Tommy was to Adrian's right. Davis Holt was 3 seats down. Vincent Caruso. 2 other senior figures whose names and roles were known to everyone in the room and unknown to anyone outside it. Raymond stood by the door. I'm going to be brief, Adrian said. The room listened. This morning, I signed a legal agreement with my wife's attorney that begins the process of restructuring this organization's financial and governance model. Independent oversight, distributed decision-making, transparency to the extent that our legal situation requires it. He paused. Those terms are final. They're not open for revision. Nobody spoke. What happened after that meeting, Adrian continued, is what we're here to address tonight. He nodded to Raymond. Raymond handed out a single page to each person at the table. The page contained a summary, carefully prepared by Raymond in the past 2 hours, of the anonymous submission to the Southern District, what it contained, when it was submitted, what its likely effect was on the DOJ monitoring agreement and on Vivian's legal position. The room read. The room's quality of silence changed as it read. Then Adrian said, The document submitted to the Southern District contained information from a folder I produced in this morning's meeting, a folder that I gave directly to my wife's attorney as part of the settlement process. That folder contained sensitive organizational records. He looked down the table at Sal. The question this council needs to answer, he said, is who accessed the contents of that folder and submitted them to federal authorities in a way designed to implicate multiple members of this organization, including a woman in the process of legally separating herself from it. Sal met his eyes. The room felt the electricity between them, the specific current of two men who have had the confrontation already in private and are now having it again in public, which is a different confrontation entirely. "I don't know what you're implying," Sal said. "I'm not implying anything," Adrian said. "I'm asking a direct question in front of this council." "You're accusing me?" "I'm asking a question," Adrian said. His voice was even. "If you have an answer, give it." Sal's jaw tightened. His hands, Adrian noticed, were flat on the table. Still steady. The man's hands were always steady. "I was in the lobby of that building this morning," Sal said. "I've already acknowledged that. I wanted to know—" "You had a contact inside the meeting," Adrian said. A beat. "That's an accusation," Sal said. "It's a statement," Adrian said. "Cross's associate, the young man who delivered a message during the meeting. We have building security footage of him leaving the building 12 minutes after the meeting began, using a side exit. We have his phone records from this morning showing a call to a number registered to a man named Corso." He paused. "You're Corso." The room was very still. Sal said nothing. "Naomi Cross's associate," Davis Holt said from down the table. He said it slowly, working through it. "He was Cross's own person." "Cross hired him 8 months ago," Raymond said from the door. "Through a staffing firm. We're looking at who owns the staffing firm." "Sal." The word came from Vincent Caruso, quiet and flat, and carrying the specific weight of a man who has just understood something he'd been resisting understanding. "You had a person inside Cross's office." Sal looked at Vincent, then at Tommy, then at Adrian. His hands were still flat on the table. "The organization was in crisis," Sal said. "I was protecting my interests." "By feeding organizational intelligence to the Southern District," Adrian said. "I didn't— by using information from this morning's meeting to submit a document that implicates this organization, implicates me, and specifically implicates my wife, a woman who was in the process of a legal exit and who had done nothing to threaten you, in a way that would close her exit and create leverage." He stopped. His voice was level, but the level of it was costing him something, which everyone in the room could hear. "You tried to use her as a weapon." Sal's composure had been eroding in small, visible increments throughout the conversation. Not dramatically. Sal Benedetti didn't do dramatic. But the increments were real, and the room was watching them accumulate. "What she was doing was going to destroy the Lakeview deal," Sal said. "My money." "Your money," Tommy said. The two words came out flat and cold and final, the voice of a man who had made a decision. "You burned down a federal agreement and implicated a civilian to protect a real estate deal." Sal looked at Tommy. The look between them lasted long enough to be a conversation. "I protected my position," Sal said. Quieter now. Something had shifted in him. Not collapse, but recalibration. The calculation of a man reassessing terrain. "You played both sides," Davis Holt said. "You kept your seat at this table while building exits in every direction." "Every man in this room has exit strategies," Sal said. "Not every man in this room took one," Adrian said. Sal looked at him. "You're finished here," Adrian said. "That's the council's decision to make, not mine alone. But I'm asking the council to make it tonight." He looked around the table. Vincent Caruso said, "Out." Davis Holt said, "Agreed." Tommy said nothing. He didn't need to. The two other senior figures exchanged a look and nodded. Sal stood up slowly. He straightened his jacket. He picked up nothing from the table because he'd brought nothing to the table. He looked at Adrian one last time. "You've changed," he said. "This version of you, I don't know it." "I know," Adrian said. Sal walked to the door. Raymond stepped aside. Sal went through. The door closed. The room let out a collective breath that none of them had realized they'd been holding. Adrian sat down. He was aware suddenly of how tired he was. The specific bone-level exhaustion of a day that had been running since before dawn, that had moved through legal meetings and restaurant confrontations and Westchester kitchens, and now this room, and that wasn't finished yet. "The Southern District," Vincent said. "Cross is filing tonight," Raymond said. "A formal brief establishing Vivian's legal separation from the organization and providing the text message from Benedetti's contact as evidence of interference. It won't close the inquiry, but it establishes the record." "And Nico Ferretti?" Tommy asked. "We've confirmed he had contact with the Maranzano operation," Raymond said. "We're deciding what to do with that information." Bring it to Bauer, Adrian said. The federal liaison, all of it. The Maranzano contact, the Southern District submission, Sal's position. We put it in front of Bauer, and we let the federal process work. He looked around the table. We've been managing around federal scrutiny for years. We're done managing around it. We're going to work with it. The table absorbed that. That's a significant shift, Vincent said. Yes, Adrian said. It is. He stood again. Go home, he said to the room. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. We start building what this organization looks like going forward. Tonight, go home. They went. Raymond stayed. When the room was empty, Raymond said, Vivian knows about the submission framing? Yes. Cross's brief tonight will help her position, Raymond said, but it doesn't fully close the exposure. I know. What closes it? Adrian looked at him. I do, he said. My cooperation with Bauer's office. Full transparency on the structural changes we're making. My personal statement to the Southern District about the nature of Vivian's involvement, that it was marital and coerced by circumstance, not strategic. He paused. And the fact that the person who submitted that document was trying to destabilize a legitimate legal proceeding, which Cross is going to make very clear. Raymond was quiet. You're cooperating with federal investigators, he said. Not a judgment, just naming it. I'm cooperating with the truth, Adrian said. There's a version of this where I fight everything and lose everything. There's a version where I cooperate with the parts that protect the people who deserve protecting. He stopped. Vivian deserves protecting. Whatever I did or didn't do, she deserves to get out of this clean. Raymond looked at him for a long time. 11 years, Raymond said. Yes. I've never heard you say something like that. Adrian looked at him. I know. Raymond picked up his briefcase. He moved toward the door. Raymond, Adrian said. He stopped. Thank you, Adrian said. For tonight, for all of it. Raymond nodded once, the nod of a man who doesn't need thanks but accepts them when they're genuine. He left. Adrian stood alone in the meeting room. He picked up his phone. He looked at it. He called Vivian. It rang twice. The council met, he said. Sal is out. Raymond is working with Cross on the federal brief tonight. I'm going to make a formal statement to Bauer's office first thing tomorrow. A pause on her end. What kind of statement? The kind that makes your position clear, he said. Your involvement was marital. You were a spouse who managed a financial structure in good faith. Whatever exposure the organization has, it doesn't attach to you. She was quiet for a moment. You'll expose yourself doing that, she said. I know. Adrian, it's the right thing, he said. And the simplicity of the sentence, after everything, the number of complex words that had been spoken today, in how many rooms to how many people, the simplicity of it landed between them like something very small and very heavy. She breathed. Will it be enough? She said. The statement for the Southern District. I don't know, he said honestly, but it gives you the best shot. She was quiet for a long time. I'll be at Naomi's office at 7, she said, to work on the brief. All right. Adrian. A pause. What happens to you if this doesn't... Let me worry about that, he said. I'm asking. He thought about it. Really thought about it for the first time all day. What happened to him if the federal cooperation didn't land the way he needed it to? If the brief didn't hold? If the Southern District decided that the organization's ledger was too large to be managed through good faith restructuring and transparent cooperation? He thought about the possibility of that outcome. He held it, didn't flinch from it. Then I'll deal with it, he said. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quieter than it had been all night. You should have been this person sooner, she said. He closed his eyes. I know, he said. The line went quiet between them. Not dead, just quiet. The kind of quiet where two people are on either end of a connection and neither has anything more to say right now, but neither hangs up either, because hanging up would be a kind of finality that the moment isn't quite ready for. Then she said very quietly, "Get some sleep." And she ended the call. He stood in the empty meeting room with his phone in his hand and the estate around him dark and quiet. The security rotation doing its slow circuit outside, the city glowing on the horizon like it always did, indifferent and permanent and burning with all the lives being lived inside it. He thought about what tomorrow held. Bauer's office, the Southern District, whatever Sal was doing right now in whatever room he'd retreated to. The Maranzano situation, the restructuring, the council, the 18 months of transition that Vivian's agreement had set in motion. I thought about the man who had stood in this room an hour ago and asked his council to vote, and had then sat down in a chair like a man who was done standing above things. And he thought about whether that man was someone he could sustain. He didn't know. He knew that the answer would become clear not in this room tonight, but in the sequence of rooms that came after, the federal offices and the legal proceedings, and the reorganized structure of an organization trying to become something different than what it had always been. He thought about Vivian walking out of the ballroom without looking back, the specific quality of that exit, the preparation behind it, the years of patience that had preceded it, and the single clean moment of action that had ended it. He thought about what it would take, what kind of daily discipline, what kind of sustained and unglamorous honesty, to be a man who deserved to have recognized her sooner. He wasn't sure he could be that man. He was sure he was going to try. He turned off the meeting room light. He walked down the hallway of his own estate in the dark. And upstairs, in his study, the briefcase sat on the desk with nothing left inside it, the folder gone, the records given away, the leverage surrendered, and what remained was only the morning, and whatever the morning decided to make of him. The morning came in gray and cold, the way October mornings do when they've decided to mean business. Adrian was awake before 5. He hadn't slept well. Not badly either, just lightly, the sleep of a man whose body understood that rest was necessary even when the mind refused to fully release. He lay in the dark for 20 minutes after his eyes opened, listening to the estate settle around him, the old sounds of the building, the heating system, the occasional creak of the upper hallway, the distant movement of the security rotation outside. Sounds he'd lived inside for years without hearing them. He heard them now. He was dressed and downstairs by 5:30. He made his own coffee. The kitchen staff didn't arrive until 7, and he didn't call anyone in early. He stood at the counter and worked the machine himself, which he hadn't done in years. And the ordinariness of it, the measuring, the waiting, the specific sound of water moving through the grounds, was something he needed without knowing he'd needed it. He drank the coffee standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden in the pre-dawn dark. By 6:15 he was in the car. Raymond met him in front of Bauer's building at 7:05, which meant Raymond had been awake since well before 5 and had said nothing about it. The Federal Liaison Office occupied 3 floors of a building in Lower Manhattan that looked like any other building on its block. No signage that meant anything to anyone passing by. No indication from the outside of what happened on the inside. Adrian had been in this building before, twice, for meetings that had been careful and productive and had resulted in the monitoring agreement that had kept the DOJ from doing something more consequential for 4 years. This visit was different. Bauer met them in a conference room on the 2nd floor. He was a compact, gray-haired man of indeterminate middle age who wore the same style of suit every time Adrian had seen him. Navy, unremarkable, a tie that suggested he'd owned it for years. He had the face of a man who had heard a very large number of things over a very long career and had trained himself not to react to any of them on the surface. He shook Adrian's hand. He shook Raymond's hand. He sat down. He had a folder in front of him. Adrian recognized the shape of it, a federal folder, the particular thickness that meant it had been assembled over time rather than overnight. He'd been building something in that folder for a while. The anonymous submission had simply moved it to the front of the agenda. "Mr. Moretti," Bauer said, "I appreciate you coming in." "I asked for the meeting," Adrian said. "Yes." Bauer looked at him. "That's noted." What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes. Adrian had prepared for it with Raymond the previous night, but preparation for a conversation like this one was only useful up to a point. Beyond that point, you were in it, and being in it required the thing Adrian had spent his life avoiding in rooms like this: complete honesty about things that could hurt him. He gave it. Not because he'd become a different person overnight, not because a transformation of character happened cleanly or completely or in the space of a crisis, but because he had made a calculation, the last calculation of its kind he intended to make. And the calculation was this: that protecting himself at Vivian's expense, in this room, on this morning, was something he was no longer willing to do. He told Bauer about the organization's financial structure, about Vivian's role in it, about the nature of that role, that it had been built inside a marriage, that she had acted in good faith, that the legal instruments bearing her name had been constructed with her active participation, but without full transparency about what she was agreeing to, because the marriage itself had been the context and the marriage had not been equal. He said that last part without softening it. Bauer listened. He told Bauer about the anonymous submission, about Sal Benedetti, about Nico Ferretti, and the Maranzano contact. He laid it out in the same sequence Tommy had laid it out on the legal pad. Inference labeled as inference, confirmed information labeled as confirmed, the structure of what he believed had happened and why he believed it. He gave Bauer the text message that Vivian had forwarded the night before. Raymond placed a printed copy on the table. Bauer read it. He didn't react on the surface, but he read it twice, which was a reaction of its own kind. "The cross brief," Bauer said. "Ms. Hale's attorney filed last night." "Yes," Adrian said. "It's consistent with what you're telling me this morning." "It should be," Adrian said, "because it's the same truth." Bauer looked at him steadily. "Mr. Moretti, the monitoring agreement, the terms you signed yesterday with Ms. Cross, the oversight structure, the transparency commitments, your intention is to honor those." "My intention is to go further than those," Adrian said. Bauer raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "The organization is restructuring," Adrian said. "What I'm describing to you this morning is the first part of a full cooperation with that process. I'm not asking for protection. I'm asking for the opportunity to demonstrate, over the next 18 months, that what I'm building is different from what I had." He paused. "And I'm asking for Vivian Hale to be treated as what she is, a person exiting a structure she was inside by circumstance of marriage. Not a conspirator, not a participant, a spouse who managed what her husband built." Bauer sat with that. "That's a significant ask," he said. "I know," Adrian said. "In exchange for significant cooperation." "In exchange for the truth," Adrian said. "Whatever you do with the cooperation is your office's determination. I'm not bargaining. I'm telling you what I know and what I'm going to do, and what Vivian Hale deserves to have on the record." Bauer looked at him for a long time. Then he made a note on the pad in front of him. "I'll need to speak with Ms. Cross directly," he said, "and with Ms. Hale." "She'll be available," Adrian said. He didn't know that for certain, but he said it without hesitation, because he believed it, and because some things you had to say before you knew them to be true. The meeting ended at 9:47. Outside on the street, Raymond said, "That was—" "Don't," Adrian said. Raymond closed his mouth. They stood on the sidewalk in the October morning, the city going fully about its business around them. A delivery truck idled at the curb. A woman in a long coat walked past reading something on her phone. Pigeons did what pigeons do on city sidewalks, which is to say they did exactly what they wanted. "What now?" Raymond said. Adrian looked at the street. "Now we find out if it holds." It held. Not immediately, and not cleanly, and not in the way that things hold in stories where the right action produces the right outcome in a satisfying sequence. It held the way. Real things hold, gradually, unevenly, with setbacks and delays and moments of uncertainty that lasted longer than they should have and cost more than they deserved to. The Southern District Inquiry formally narrowed its scope within 3 weeks of Adrian's meeting with Bauer, focusing on the anonymous submission itself rather than on the Moretti organization's historical structure. Naomi Cross's brief had established sufficient ground. Bauer's office, working with information Adrian had provided, built a case around Sal Benedetti and Nico Ferretti's coordination that moved quickly once it had direction. Sal Benedetti was formally investigated by the end of November. He didn't go quietly. Men like Sal never went quietly. He had his own attorneys, his own networks, his own version of events that he pushed through whatever channels were available to him. He contested every connection, disputed every inference, challenged the text message's provenance, and spent a considerable amount of money making things as complicated as possible. But Corso gave a statement. Cross's associate, the one who'd been placed in her office 8 months earlier, gave a statement when it became clear that Sal's protection was worth less than his own freedom. And Nico Ferretti, who had always operated on the principle that loyalty was a product of circumstance, found circumstances that made a different decision more appealing. The Maranzano connection, once surfaced, became its own federal investigation. That one moved slowly, the way investigations involving multiple families always move slowly, carefully, methodically, with the patience of institutions that understood they had time. Sal was gone from the Moretti organization, and he didn't come back. The Lakeview deal collapsed. The financing structure had depended on instruments that no longer existed in the form they'd been built, and reconstructing them inside the new oversight framework took longer than the contract window allowed. Vincent Caruso absorbed the loss with the face of a man who'd absorbed losses before. He didn't stop doing business with the organization. He adjusted. Most people adjusted. That was the thing Adrian hadn't fully anticipated. That adjustment, not loyalty, was what actually sustained an organization through change. Loyalty was weather. Adjustment was infrastructure. The people who stayed were the ones who could recalibrate their expectations and find something workable in the new version, and the ones who couldn't recalibrate left. And the leaving was almost never dramatic. The 18 months of transition were the hardest work Adrian had done in his life. Not because of the legal complexity, though that was considerable. Not because of the federal cooperation, though there were days when that felt like dismantling his own house board by board. It was hard because it required him to sit in rooms where he had previously been the unchallenged authority and participate in decisions he would once have made alone, and to do that without the armor of absolute control, which was the only armor he'd ever really known how to wear. The Independent Oversight Board met for the first time in January. 3 people: a former federal judge, a corporate compliance specialist, and a banking attorney with international credentials, who reviewed every major decision the organization made and whose approval was required for anything above a certain financial threshold. The first meeting lasted 4 hours. Adrian sat in it and answered questions and produced documents and did all the things that a man does when he is no longer the only person in the room whose opinion matters, and he did it without walking out, which on the 3rd hour of the 4th meeting felt like an achievement. Davis Holt ran the day-to-day operations with an efficiency that Adrian hadn't anticipated and probably should have. The young man was genuinely good at the organizational version of the work, the coordination, the communication, the practical management of a complex structure in transition. Adrian watched him and thought about what it meant to have had capable people around you and not see them clearly, and recognized that this too had been a failure of vision. He started seeing things more clearly. It was not a comfortable process. Tommy Ricci retired from active operations in March. Not dramatically. He simply informed Adrian that he was stepping back, that he had adequate resources, that he wished the organization well, and that he was going to spend more time at his house in Westchester and less time reading reports on laptops at his kitchen table. He and Adrian had lunch before he left, at a restaurant in the neighborhood, not the organization's restaurant, a regular place, the kind that had been there for 40 years and wasn't trying to impress anyone. They ate pasta and talked about things other than work for the first time in years, and it was awkward at first, and then it wasn't, and when Tommy left, he shook Adrian's hand and held it for an extra second, which was as close as either of them had ever come to saying the things that were behind the handshake. Vivian's company launched in February. She called it Hale Capital, which was direct in the way she was direct, her name, her capital, nothing that required interpretation. It opened with offices in Midtown and a founding portfolio of 7 investments, each of them in early-stage businesses run by entrepreneurs who had been told no by people who hadn't looked closely enough. The launch received coverage in 2 financial publications. The coverage was respectful and specific, noting her background in financial structuring and international banking relationships without mentioning the Moretti name in a way that required a response. Naomi Cross had managed that carefully. Adrian read both articles. He read them twice. He sat with the particular sensation of reading about Vivian in a professional context that had nothing to do with him. Not as his wife, not as the woman who'd built the architecture of his empire, not as anything connected to his name, just as herself. Vivian Hale, founder, investor, the woman with the long-established banking relationships and the precise financial mind and the founding portfolio of 7 businesses she'd believed in. He felt something reading it. He didn't entirely know what to call the feeling. Pride, maybe. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that acknowledges something good without being able to claim credit for it. He didn't call her when he read the articles. He had spoken to her twice in the months since the federal meetings, both times briefly, through Naomi Cross, about specific organizational matters that required her cooperation during the transition period. The conversations had been professional and efficient and had ended without anything personal being said, which was the correct version of events, and which he understood even when he didn't prefer it. I was not going to be the man who called his estranged wife to say he'd read her press coverage. He folded the articles and put them in a drawer. The divorce was finalized in April. Raymond brought him the paperwork on a Thursday afternoon. It sat on his desk for 3 hours before he opened it. When he did, he read it the way he'd read the financial documents in the early days of the crisis, looking for something, some detail that needed attention. There was nothing that needed attention. It was complete. Every asset properly delineated, every instrument properly documented, every connection between his life and hers properly severed and assigned to its correct account. He signed his name in 4 places. His handwriting was the same as it always was. Not shaking, not different, just his handwriting. He put the pen down. He sat in his study for a while afterward, not working, not on the phone, just sitting. Outside this window. The estate gardens were green for the first time in months. Late spring had arrived and the trees were doing what they did when given the chance, which was grow without asking anyone's permission. He thought about 17 years, not in a sentimental sweep. He was not a sentimental man, or had not been. And the practice of becoming something different was slower than a single afternoon. But he thought about specific things. The legal pad Vivian had carried through the estate before it was renovated, making notes. The way she'd known which walls were load-bearing. The years of parties and negotiations and quiet management. The folder he'd kept for 12 years and had finally given away. I thought about what it cost a person to be capable and invisible at the same time for years, inside a life that took their capability for granted. He thought about what it had cost her specifically. He didn't think he fully understood the answer, and he was aware that not fully understanding was part of the cost. The meeting by the river happened in June. It wasn't planned. That was the first thing. It wasn't planned, and that mattered, because everything between them for the past year had been planned, managed, mediated, processed through attorneys and compliance officers, and the careful machinery of legal separation. This was neither of those things. Vivian had walked along the Hudson River path on Saturday mornings for as long as Adrian had known her. It was a habit she'd had before they met and had maintained through the marriage, usually early, usually alone. He knew this the way he knew the facts of a person who had been inside his life for 17 years. He had not known she was going to be there. He was walking the same path because Raymond had told him, some months ago, in one of Raymond's rare moments of unprompted personal advice, that walking was useful when the head was full, and Adrian's head had been full since the divorce papers, and the walk was something to do with the fullness. He came around the bend near the river overlook, and she was there. She was standing at the railing, looking out at the water, a coffee cup in her hand, wearing a gray jacket he hadn't seen before. Her hair was down, the same as it had been in the conference room in October, and she'd cut it slightly shorter since then, which he noticed because he noticed things about her involuntarily, the way you notice things that have been part of your vision for a long time. She heard him before he reached her. She turned. There was a moment, not long, maybe 2 seconds, where both of them held the surprise of it, the unmanaged reality of accidentally sharing a space with someone you've been carefully not sharing space with. And then the moment passed, and they were just 2 people at a river overlook on a Saturday morning in June, which was ordinary enough to work with. "Adrian," she said. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see that." She looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding how to approach, with the full attention of a person who doesn't waste attention, who turns it on like a light and illuminates whatever it lands on completely. He must have looked tired. He was tired, probably. The kind of tired that settles into a person over a long stretch and becomes hard to distinguish from just the way you are now. "Sit down," she said. She nodded toward the bench beside the railing. He sat down. She sat beside him, not close, leaving the appropriate space of 2 people who were no longer whatever they had been. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the water. The Hudson in June was doing its gray-green river thing, moving steadily south with the general indifference of large bodies of water to the concerns of people on their banks. "How's the company?" he said. "Growing," she said. "Slowly, which is correct. We're adding 2 new investments next quarter. One of them is a logistics startup run by a 26-year-old who couldn't get a bank to look at her. She's going to be remarkable." "That sounds like you," he said. She glanced at him, something in the glance that wasn't quite warmth but was adjacent to it. How is the restructuring? She asked. Slow, he said, which is also correct, I suppose. The oversight board? It's working, he said. It's not comfortable, but it's working. She nodded. They sat with the river for a minute. Sal's situation, she said. I heard it moved into the next phase. Last month, he said. His attorney is negotiating. It'll take time. And Nico Ferretti? Gone, he said simply, cooperating with the other investigation. He'll surface somewhere in a reduced capacity eventually. He always does. She made a small sound, so not quite acknowledgement, not quite dismissal. Cross said you were thorough with Bauer, she said, in October. I tried to be. You told him things you didn't have to tell him, she said, things that cost you. He looked at the water. You deserve to be described accurately, he said, whatever it cost. She was quiet. He looked at his hands resting on his knees, the absence of the wedding ring, which was a thing he'd stopped noticing daily, but noticed now in this specific context, the way you notice absences in the places where they originally lived. I kept the articles, he said. She looked at him. The launch coverage, he said. Hail Capital. I read both pieces. He paused. I kept them. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not readable in the simple way of expressions that have only one thing in them. It was the expression of a person who feels several things simultaneously and has had enough experience with complexity not to try to reduce it. Adrian, she said. I know, he said. I'm not saying it to start something. I'm saying it because keeping them was the honest thing, and I'm trying to be honest now, even about small things. He stopped, especially about small things. The small things are what I was dishonest about for the longest. She looked back at the river. You erased my name for 12 years, she said. Not angrily. The anger had been spent, not forgiven, but metabolized, turned from something hot into something that simply was, a fact, a scar. From my own work. You kept the records and you still erased the name. Yes, he said. And then you gave me the records. Yes. Why, she said. The real reason, not the version you've given other people. He thought about that. Because I could see what I'd done, he said, for the first time clearly, and I didn't want to be the man who saw it clearly and still chose himself. He paused. I've been that man for a long time. I was tired of it. She breathed in through her nose. He could see the rise of it, the deliberate breath of a person taking in something that requires processing. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, she said. I know. Because it isn't. What you did, the systematic erasure of it, the years of it, that's not something I can make all right for you. That's yours to carry. I know that too, he said. But she stopped. She looked at the river. I don't want to spend the next part of my life being angry about the part that's done. Anger takes up space I need for other things. She turned and looked at him directly. So I'm not going to be angry at you, not because you've earned that, because I've decided not to waste it. He looked at her. She met his eyes. Thank you, he said, for October, for the way you handled it. There were 100 ways you could have made it worse for me. I know, she said. You didn't. I know, she said again. That was my choice. Not for you. For me. Because the woman I want to be doesn't burn things down on the way out. He nodded. Real love, she said quietly, almost to herself, can't survive where respect doesn't exist. She said it flatly, the way you say a thing you've known for a long time and are now simply naming out loud. I knew that for years before I did anything about it. Why didn't you? He started. Because I loved you, she said, even when it wasn't enough, even when the structure of what we had was wrong. She paused. People stay in things longer than they should because the love is real, even when the conditions are wrong. That's not weakness. It's just human. He had nothing to say to that. Not because there was nothing to feel, but because what he felt was too large and too late to be usefully expressed in this conversation, on this bench, beside this river. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down on the bench between them. She looked at the city across the water, the skyline that had been the backdrop of their shared life, the buildings and the bridges and the particular Manhattan light that existed nowhere else. What are you going to do? She said. With the organization, long term. I don't know, he said. Davis is capable. The oversight board is stable. Maybe in another year. He stopped. Maybe the honest answer is that I'm figuring out who I am when I'm not the person in the center of the room. She looked at him. That's a more honest answer than I expected, she said. I'm working on honest, he said. Something moved through her expression. The adjacent to warmth thing again. Complicated. Real. You should, she said. She stood up. He stood up, because that was the correct response. They stood beside the bench in the June morning, the river moving behind them, the city going about its Saturday. And they looked at each other the way two people look at each other when they are deciding how to end a conversation that is also the end of something larger. He put his hand out. She looked at it. She shook it. Her hand in his for 3 seconds. Not the grip of strangers, not the grip of spouses, something in between that had no name because there was no established category for what they were to each other now. Then she let go. She picked up her coffee cup. She said, "Take care of yourself, Adrian." And he said, "You too." She walked back along the path the way she'd come, and he watched her go. Not with the desperate attention of a man watching something leave that he wants to stop, but with the honest attention of a man looking at something he had not seen clearly for a long time and was now seeing, finally, for what it was. A woman walking in the morning with somewhere to be, in a life that belonged entirely to her. He watched until she was around the bend. Then he turned back to the river and stood there for a while. The water moved south the way it always moved. The city made its city sounds. A boat went by at the appropriate distance, doing whatever boats do on rivers on June mornings, which is to say it went where it was going and didn't ask anything of the shore. Adrian stood at the railing where she'd been standing and looked at what she'd been looking at, trying to see what she'd seen. The gray-green water, the opposite bank, the bridge in the distance catching the morning light in the way steel catches light, cold and true and indifferent to how it looks. He thought about a wall he'd been told about years ago in a house that was becoming an estate, that some walls are load-bearing and some aren't, and the critical skill is knowing the difference. He thought he was beginning, slowly and imperfectly and years too late, to understand which was which. He straightened up. He put his hands in his pockets. He walked back along the river path, north, toward whatever the rest of his life had decided to be. Behind him, the Hudson kept moving, the way rivers always keep moving, patient, continuous, indifferent to the stories told on their banks, carrying everything that falls into them eventually out to the wider water, where the current runs too deep and too broad to be troubled by the weight of a single stone. This has been a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations depicted are imaginary and bear no connection to real persons